Here she is.
Hi, Randall.
Give you a headphone.
Hi, Leanna.
Oh
Now
wait,
that's
Hi,
a
Leanna.
that's a real baby there, isn't it?
that's a real
That's a real
baby.
baby.
Oh,
Wow. Now she must be. Gosh, let me see. She's not just newborn like in the last few weeks. She's
Almost.
got,
Is
I'll say
she
3 months.
two months?
Almost 2 months.
She's 2 months.
2 months.
Yeah,
Okay.
so she'll be on one of your trips anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, start them early. That's
Yeah,
well. Look at that.
Look, she looks super smart. And
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She has been so far. She already knows how to roll. She knows how to swat at things. She knows how to grab things. Pretty intelligent
She's a
already.
really good
Impressive.
girl.
Very,
thank
very
you.
impressed. Job well done.
Thanks. So
Thank
we'll
you.
see you in Sedona. We'll be on your Sedona trip.
Yeah, cool.
Cool.
That's going to be fun.
Super
Wonderful.
fun.
Sweet.
Angel's excited.
Anyways, I just wanted to show you, and some big
Well,
changes have happened.
I mean, that's something to be proud of there.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
This is
Hi, Angel.
Biggest
Hi,
achievement.
This is Uncle
Angel.
Randall.
Hi, Randall.
Hi, Angel. Right with my-
All right. Well, we're gonna
Oh,
get
God.
started here.
All right.
Sweet. All right.
All right.
Thanks for stopping by.
Bye.
Podcast. Good luck. I can't wait to hear everything that happens
Great.
and everything that you guys discuss.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
All right. That was a good way to start.
Yeah. So go right from there to the moon is what you're saying. There's a
Yeah.
logical progression there.
Anyways, you are a man who needs no introduction. You've been on the show before, and we got into some really deep things, and we left quite a bit to talk about. And that's one thing that really impresses me about you is I've been listening to hundreds of hours of your content, and there's always more to learn.
I know. I'm like the what do you call it, the wind up bunny or something. I just keep going and going, and then probably till the day I drop. One day I'll just be in the middle of the greatest discovery and realization of my life, and it'll just be too much to handle.
Well, we have to discover some ancient technology for immortality or something to keep it going.
Well, actually, now that you bring that up, I mean, there actually could be, on the threshold of something like that.
Really?
And oh yeah, I mean, we should talk about the whole plasma technology thing that's emerging as we speak. We should talk about that a little bit, and I will pull that because there are certain things when you're looking at the whole conglomeration of different fields and sciences and areas of research and things that people are exploring. One of the really challenges is try to make some kind of coherent system out of to make some coherent understanding that bridges the gaps between the different fields and the different areas of human action and human mentation, uh, the sciences, all of that. So that's the challenge, right? So I'm always looking for things that will serve to kind of integrate what would otherwise be disparate traditions, whatever. I mean, if you're looking at, okay, so the obvious big divide that has been acknowledged by scholarship for well more than probably a century and a half is the divide between religion and science. You can start with that, religion and science, and now you got religion has all kinds of offshoots into the philosophical realm and into different um, religious views of creation and origin stories and prophecies and all of that. You go over to the science realm, and you can see that when science really started becoming a thing a couple of hundred years ago, you had this you had the entity who was the cosmographer, and the cosmographer was the guy who pretty much was able to wrap his head around most of what was out there in the scientific realm. Right? Somebody the obvious embodiment of the cosmographer could be somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, who bridged science on the one hand, engineering on the other hand, art on the other hand, right? So he was a cosmographer. Newton was a cosmographer. In the same way, it's not so well known, of course, that his establishing the cornerstone of modern physics, it's not nearly as well known his researches into ancient traditions and alchemy and hermetic wisdom and all of this kind of stuff. But he was very, very much into all of that. So what I'm getting at, I guess, here is that what we need now is, because we've got so many factions of knowing, of ways of knowing the world. And what we need is some kind of coherency, some kind of a system whereby we can begin to integrate and see. Because in my mind, I don't really see a contradiction between science and religion. Now, religion, a lot of religion is based upon the idea of faith. You have this belief in a higher order of consciousness, a greater being, some kind of harmony in the universe. You have faith in something, right? In science, you don't have faith. You exercise your reason, and you don't really put belief in something without testing, without rigorous testing. And only when you've gone through this whole process of rigorous testing do you then endow your belief into that. And that's the natural metamorphosis from like, let's just say an intuition to the formation of a hypothesis, to that hypothesis evolving into a full-blown theory. And you understand there's a difference between a hypothesis and a theory. A hypothesis is something you set up specifically for the purposes of testing. So what I guess I'm getting at here is, like, in my mind, if I read ancient scriptures, if I read the Bible, or if I read the Vedas, if I read the Mahabharata or the Puranas, or any of the other literature that would be considered sacred literature, I kind of am trying to read it from the standpoint of science. Like, I don't see that I don't feel compelled to have faith without some kind of confirmation. I personally, if I have faith, let me put it this way. If I have faith, it's faith in the power of human reason, faith in my own power of reasoning, and in general, the power of reason that the human species is endowed with, that makes us distinguishable from all other forms of life, is the power of reason. Well, I consider within within the spiritual framework in which I think, in which I consider reality, is that I have faith in the power of reason. And I have faith in the idea that our reason is an endowment from our Creator. So with that perspective, I have no contradiction between science and religion. Does that make sense, what I've been trying to say
That
here?
makes perfect sense. And I really appreciate what you're saying, because I've always felt like it's been a massive disservice to separate the two, spirituality and science. And
Yes.
I love how you connect the dots between the two, because they really complement each other. I feel like when you go really deep into science, you kind of get to the end of the road, and then you have to start being spiritual, and vice versa. When you're very religious, you're missing some of the facts and the stories. And one of the things you talk about a lot that ties the two together is sacred geometry, which I've gone to very scientific people and I've showed them sacred geometry, and they appreciate it and it makes sense to them. And then I go to somebody that's very religious, and sacred geometry can prove the existence of God or the creator,
Yeah. There was recently an interest, somebody did I forgot, it was the first time I'd seen the website. I think it aligns with my philosophy, overall my political philosophy, which is also derivative from my spiritual philosophy, which is that the other endowment that goes along hand in hand with reason is freedom, because we have to have the freedom to be able to think and learn and research and communicate the results of that process to other people, to the world at large. So I'm very much about so thinking in terms of the importance of freedom, which I place right alongside, I would say, three things that are the three pillars of an ethical life and an ethical society. And those three pillars are freedom, peace, and truth. You've got to hold all of those in the highest esteem. And if you're going to build a business, if you're going to build a family, if you're going to build a nation, I think those three pillars are the fundamental things you have to have. And you can't really have you can't have one of them without the others. I think that's clear. In fact, you have to have all three of them, because as soon as you've compromised one of them, you've compromised the other two. If you let's say compromise peace, and it's been well said. Who was the famous general? I think it was. Who was it? You might know. Who said the first casualty of war is the truth? The first casualty of war is the truth. And
Is that Sun Tzu, maybe?
That could be. Sure. Either I would say Sun Tzu, maybe Clausewitz, maybe somebody more contemporary. I don't remember, but I'm sure somebody listening, it's easy enough to look up. But yeah, the first casualty of war is the truth, and I've now lived through enough wars in my life that I've seen in every case, yes, that happens to be the case. We go to war based on lies for the most part, and those wars are justified on a continuum of lies. And of course, what's also lost in the process is freedom. All we have to do is look at our own history in the last quarter century. Since the turn of the 20th to the 21st century, what have we seen? Well, we've seen, at 9/11, whatever the explanation is behind that, and we won't get into that now, but after 9/11, everything, we have been in a state of perpetual war, basically since 9/11. Once we got into Afghanistan, into Iraq, in the Middle East, we have now literally been in a state of perpetual war, either, hotly, like in Iraq. I mean, going in there, and I don't know how many 200,000 Iraqi civilians lost their lives in that. And of course, all based on what? Lies. The lies of weapons of mass destruction, which we're still waiting on. And, they're out there somewhere, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. But I cite this as an example of, we've lost a lot of freedom since prior, I've been around since the middle of the 20th century. So I'm old enough now to have seen this progressive incremental loss of our freedom. Now, one big alteration that occurred in my lifetime, which when I came up as a child and into a young man, is we had a national draft. So when I turned 18 years old, I had to sign up for the draft, and my generation was being actively drafted and sent around the world to fight this war with a small third world nation that had no army, had no navy, had no air force, but represented supposedly this big threat to huge United States. It's had many times the economy of Vietnam. But what happened out of Vietnam is that the lies got all exposed. The Gulf of Tonkin, total lie, made up completely, right, to justify the buildup. But out of that, there came this compelling sense that we got to get back to having the truth. We've got to declassify information. They had the My Lai hearings, so we all learned firsthand about what happened when American soldiers lost their shit. And they went crazy and started massacring women and children. That's what happens sometimes. Soldiers become unhinged, and they lose all sense of moral proportion. And they don't differentiate. The enemy is the enemy across the spectrum. Well, we got out of Vietnam, and then we were afflicted by the Vietnam syndrome, it was called, because coming out of Vietnam, everybody was sick of war. Enough of it, sick of the bullshit, sick of the war. And so people in America started turning away from the whole imperial enterprise. Well, that was revitalized during the Reagan years. And it was in the Reagan years that we really saw the emergence of the neocon faction that is still driving our foreign policy to this day. It's the neocon faction that's driving our policy with Israel. It's the neocon faction that's driving our policy with Ukraine, with respect to Ukraine, and anywhere else we happen to be intervening. Syria is another perfect example. And how bizarre that we've deposed Assad, but now who's governing Syria is our former, Taliban, Al Qaeda affiliates that were our enemies just a few years ago. And now we've ushered them into control of Syria. Again, okay, so my point, I guess, with all of this is that I'm trying to say, you lose one, you lose the other two. If you lose, going to war required creating a false narrative and then propagating that out to the American population to keep people on board with it. So peace, freedom, and truth. And we've lost our freedom since 9/11. Now, we recovered after Vietnam. See, we recovered some of our freedom because, remember, we had a situation where you turn 18, you sign up for the draft, then you get called up for your physical. You go, and they assess where they're going to put you into ranks. In my case, I turned 18 in 1969, and that was during the lottery. So now imagine this, okay? So they're going to have a lottery that's it's broadcast all over television, and they've got this machine there, and it's basically, if my memory serves me correct, it was one of these where they have like ping pong balls in this machine, right? And they had like 365 ping pong balls with a date written on each one, right? So the thing would do, I guess it would build up air pressure or something. The ping pong ball would pop up, and they'd take it, and they would read the date on it, right? So you've got, few million young guys my age, just turned 18 a few months earlier, and your peers are over in Vietnam right now. By that time, I already knew at least two people that I grew up with that were had died over there, right? Had died. One of them was a pilot, a gunner on a helicopter, and it was shot down. And the other one, I'm not sure really what happened to him. I don't remember. I maybe knew at the time, but everybody knew somebody that had gone there, was over there, had died over there, had come back wounded or disabled or mentally messed up with PTSD. I mean, it was very pervasive during American society, more so than now, because now we've got the all-volunteer army, and part of that Vietnam syndrome thing is what led to the all-volunteer army. But so, again, back to you got this machine there, the ping pong ball comes up, and they read off this date. So if your date comes up in the first 120 ping pong balls, you're going. They'll be contacting you within a few weeks, and you will be shipped off. And you're going to go serve a year-long tour of duty over in Vietnam. If the second 120 comes up, okay, now you've got roughly a 50-50 chance of going. And it all depends on whether or not the numbers are stabilized as they were in 68, 69. Because, the big fast buildup was really from 65 to 68, right? So now we get to 69. Is there going to be a requirement to build up more, bring up more troops? Well, so in other words, if you were in that second 120, your chances of going were at least 50-50, right? And then if you're in the final, 125, well, now you're exempt. Unless, I presume we got invaded or something. I don't know what. But the idea was, so now all these guys are sitting there watching this, and their lives, the fate of your life is now this ping pong ball that comes up, and you've got this whoever, bureaucrat or a sergeant or who I don't remember, somebody with the selective service, that's who it would have been, looking at this ping pong ball, reading off the dates. And that's what's determining whether you're going to go and firsthand experience combat in the jungles on the other side of the world. So
Wow.
I'm watching. Yeah. When you think about that, isn't that bizarre?
It's crazy. So did your number come up?
Well, we got up to about, I don't remember exactly. I mean, this is a long time ago now, so I'm kind of vague, but what I remember was we got up to, I'm thinking around 120, and my number hadn't come up yet. And I'm thinking, okay, if I might make it. I might make, because I didn't want to go. By this time, I had no belief in what we were doing over there. By this time, I'd already known soldiers that had come back. In fact, I knew soldiers that came back after their tour of duty who went over there full of piss and vinegar and patriotism and came back saying it's all bullshit. So by the time we got to 69, I had already been exposed to that. People that older guys that I knew that were a year or two ahead of me that had already done their tour of duty come back, said it's all bullshit. And so at this point, I'm not going over there. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go fight. Who are the Vietnamese? What are, and by that time, it was coming out about the massacres and this and that. So I was dead set. I didn't want to go. Now, it wasn't a lack of patriotism, and I wasn't a pacifist. I mean, if I was attacked, by contrast, let's suppose our homeland actually got attacked. Well, that's a whole different matter, isn't it? See, if our homeland got attacked, you wouldn't even have to have a draft, would you? Or at least not in my day, you wouldn't have. Almost every young red-blooded American guy, late teens, early 20s, would be right there, ready to defend our national homeland, right? But that's not what this was. This was completely about essentially control of resources, because it was believed that there was gigantic oil deposits off the east coast of Indochina, right off the east coast of Vietnam. And I think that was ultimately driving it. And then philosophically, it was, to contain communism, because had been the propaganda that people were being fed, and I suppose some actually believed it was the domino effect. Well, if Vietnam falls, then Laos is next, Cambodia is next, Thailand is next, whole of Indochina will go communist, and, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, what increased communism is that the Viet Cong, of course, were communist, right? Once we started invading and we started sending our troops over there, their recruitment went sky high, right? The Viet Cong, in other words, were not eliciting too much interest from the rest of the Vietnamese people, right? They, look, leave us alone. We want to live in our farms and our villages. We've got our livestock, we've got our families, we've got our crops, et cetera, et cetera. But when we started sending troops over, what happened then? So the Viet Cong, the ranks of the communists increased. So in other words, rather than containing communism, it almost spread it. It's maybe almost like a cancer where your intervention causes the proliferation of the cancerous cells. That's kind of what happened. So it was completely, the whole justification, we got to stop communism in Vietnam, or whole of Indochina is going to go communist. And then, that'll tip the balance of geopolitical power in favor of the communists and the Soviet Union. Of course, who at that time was our primary competitor and we were actually fighting a proxy war with both Soviet Union and China in Vietnam. It was not too much unlike what we're doing right now in Ukraine, fighting a proxy war with Russia. So anyways, back to my number, it came up somewhere between 100. It was like right in the top. So 120 to 125, it was one of those numbers in there. So I was in that bottom third. So I knew that I was going. They were going to try. So they were going to draft me, train me for 6 weeks and send me over there. And I'm thinking, shit, I got other things to do. I don't want to do that. But so I thought, well, am I going to go? What am I going to do? So I didn't go, and here I am today. But
did the war end?
Well, the war ended finally in like 5 years later.
Oh, so you didn't go?
Well, let's put it this way. I think there was an intervention. I've told this story. People have asked, and I'll tell the story one more time, and then I probably will never tell this story again. Um, it was probably early fall when I went for my physical. And I'd love to go back and recreate the timeline because again, it's gotten very blurry over the years, but I'd gone for my physical already. Um, no, I hadn't gone for my physical. I'd been called. I was going for my physical like in 2 weeks or 4 weeks or something. I had it coming up. I got the letter in the mail that I was being called up, and they, to go to get my physical, and then I would be classified. So back then, it's probably fall, late, whether it's mid fall, late fall in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And one of the things I used to do to earn money was I would hawk newspapers on the corner. And how you would do it is you would go in to the headquarters there, and you would buy 100 newspapers for $10. And then you would take that bundle of 100 newspapers, you'd go out and you'd sell them for 25 cents each. So if you sold all 100 of them, you made $15. So it was tiring because, you're out there on your feet all day out there. And I think I'd actually sold 2 whole bundles. So I might have had like $30 on me or something. And I was feeling, for an 18-year-old in 1969, $30 would probably be like having a couple of $100 right now, at least. So I'd been out all day selling these newspapers. I was done. It's probably like maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm trying to catch the last bus home, and I'm thinking that I've missed the bus. So I put my thumb out, which was something millions of people did back in those days. Hitchhiking was very widespread. You never drove anywhere without seeing a hitchhiker, sometimes many hitchhikers. So I put my thumb out. I got a ride from downtown Minneapolis, and I was standing at the corner of 2 streets, Washington and Broadway. And I walked down to the bus stop thinking, well, here's what I'll do. If the bus comes, I'll jump the bus, get home on the bus. If I've missed the last bus, I'll hitchhike, and hopefully I'll get a ride. So I'm standing there by the bus stop at the edge of the sidewalk, and this car comes cruising by, and I immediately could tell that it was an unmarked police car. And they're out, roaming. I'm the only one sign of life at this moment, at this corner, right? I see him cruising by, and I could see 2 guys in there, and so there's a couple of policemen there in an unmarked police car, and they drive down, and at the next corner they turn right, and they go, and I go, okay, so I knew then they're gonna circle the block, they're gonna come back around, and they're gonna harass me. I knew that was in the mix because I'd already been through that at least several times by that point. There was a lot of harassment that went on between agents of the state and people who were obviously wearing their rebellion against the state, where everybody could see by having long hair or the way you dressed or whatever, right? So then I was kind of out of peripheral vision, looking to the corner down on my left, and I saw some headlights coming up. Okay, that's probably them coming back around. Then the headlights stopped before the car pulled around the corner, and I thought, okay, that's definitely them. So I'm kind of looking, and then the 2 cops come walking around the corner, walking towards me. And as they're walking towards me, they're walking together, and then they split up, and one guy starts talking directly to me, like, whatever, hey, boy, what are you doing out here this time of night, or whatever. I don't remember what he was saying, but he was talking to me, walking like in front of me. His partner goes behind me. Now, I had been standing there probably for, I don't know, let's say a half hour. And it was chilly. It was like late fall. I had my hands in my coat pocket. And so when they came, he started talking to me. I took my hands out of my coat pocket. His partner comes up behind me while he's talking to me, and he reaches his hand into my coat pocket, comes out with a joint, a doobie, a marijuana cigarette. I don't know if it was marijuana or what, because I didn't have one in my pocket.
Oh, he planted it on you.
He didn't even plant it. He had it in his hand and reached his hand in my pocket, coat pocket, like, I don't know, it was all a charade. And the reason I know so well that, yeah, I didn't have one is because I remember as I was standing there thinking, man, I wish I had a joint to smoke when I got home. But I didn't have one. So okay, I get arrested and I get put in handcuffs and put in the back seat of the car, and I get hauled down to the big jailhouse down in downtown Minneapolis. And they bring me in, they process me, and they put me in the drunk tank with a bunch of drunks. And I remember there was this big drunk Indian in there, and he went ballistic over something. And so they had like 4 guards in there, and I was in this little cubby sitting there, and this is going on like literally like 5 or 6 feet out in front of me, and they're just beating the crap out of this big drunk Indian, like 4 or 5 cops in there, had him, restrained him. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into here? So morning comes, they take me out of the drunk tank, and they break me down to the official jail cell, which is this big warehouse building. And it's got two or three tiers of cells, right? And then from the top cell, it's like another 20 or 30 feet up to the ceiling of this big, like warehouse type building with all the jails, and all the jails are basically, the iron bars. So they take me down there, and we climb up, and we go up to this top level, and we walk way down to the end to the next to the last cell. The guard, and I'm handcuffed, and he takes me there. He opens the door, puts me in, takes my handcuffs off, closes the door, and there's this little fella in there. He's sure. I mean, I was probably still 6'2" then before I'd shrunk, but so he was quite a bit short. Like he maybe came up to my chin. So he was a little guy. The guard goes down to the next cell, right? Put somebody in there, maybe, I don't remember, but in any case, the little guy, he's got this gleam in his eye, and he goes, "Look what I've got." And I'm like, whoa, what now? And he reaches his hand down in his pants, comes out, and the guy's got a bag of weed, right? And he goes, "Acapulco Gold." And I don't know if you know Acapulco Gold, but back in the day, Acapulco Gold was the premier weed, right? I mean, that was the best. If you could get the Acapulco Gold, that was right up there with, Panama Red and Thai sticks and all of that, right? So, and I'm like, "Put that away, man." Like the guard is just like right there. But guard didn't pay any attention, didn't notice. So guard goes back. Turns out the guy was a professional pickpocket, right? That was what he was in there for. He was a pickpocket. So, okay, well, that fits, I guess. So anyways, then what happened was we're up there in that top tier of cells, way at the very end, and like every hour, a guard would come down, walk all the way down this long row, and at the end was one of these key switches where he would, they'd put their key in there and they would turn it, and I guess that was like, verification that they had made their rounds, and, they'd walk down there. So he would come and do that, and then he would walk away, and we could hear his steps disappearing into distance, and then my cellmate, he rolled, I don't know where he got papers, but he had papers, and he'd roll up a joint, and the ceiling of the cell was open bars. So we'd take some hits and just blow them up through the bar, and it would drift right way 30 feet up to the ceiling. So I spent the whole weekend stoned out of my mind in that jail cell, right? So now, Monday around lunchtime, they let me out. They bring me in. They let me out on my own reconnaissance because I'd lived there pretty much my whole life, and I'd never been in trouble before. And they scheduled me for a court date, which I guess was like a month or so down in the future. So I come back for my court date and go into the courtroom, and the judge is there, but the cops that busted me aren't there. So there's nobody there to witness against me. So because of there's no witnesses, then the judge says, "Well, we're going to reschedule you. You have to come back." Oh, okay. So a month later, I go back the second time. They're not there. So it gets rescheduled for the third time. maybe another month later. I go back, they're still not there. So nobody comes to testify against me. So the judge calls me back into his chamber and he says, okay, since you've never gotten in trouble before. Of course, he didn't know the true facts of the matter, how much trouble I hadn't been caught for, but put that aside for now. He says, since you've been basically a good boy and you also haven't caused any more trouble since you got busted, I'll fine you $100. We'll call it a misdemeanor because at that time I was actually a pending felon at that point because of the laws in Minnesota. So he says, we'll call it a misdemeanor, and if you stay out of trouble for 1 year, it'll be just stricken off your record. And but I'm going to fine you $100. Well, I thought was a pretty good deal. My dad gave me the $100, as a matter of fact. So I paid the $100. I walked out of there feeling good, right? Okay, so let's come back full circle here. During that interim that I was in the court system is when I got called up for my draft physical. So when I went in there, sat down, I went through the whole thing, spent all day there going through all these tests and everything. But you had these forms you had to fill out. And one of them, of course, wanted to know, have you ever been arrested? Well, I couldn't lie about it. I was in the system at that point. So yes. For what? Well, felony drug possession is what I was in the system, right? So basically, you had three classifications. You had 1A, which meant, hey, no problem, you're physically fit, you're mentally fit, we're sending you off to fight in this war. 1Y meant that, well, we'll only use you if it's on a national emergency, which in effect meant if our homeland is invaded, right? Third was a 4F. No, you're worthless. Get the hell out of here. We're not going to use you for anything. Well, so then one day, I get the envelope in the mail from Selective Service, and I'm like, oh, God, what now? Okay, right? I open it up, take it out, and there was my draft card in there with my new classification, 1Y. That was it. Didn't go.
So 1Y was the iffy. You're on the edge.
Yes, only if in national emergency, which essentially meant if we got invaded. If America got invaded, yeah, they'll call up the 1Ys.
So strangely, as fate would have it, that cop planting that joint on you kind of saved your life. Possibly.
Yeah,
saved you from going to Vietnam.
Saved me from going to Vietnam. That's why I didn't go.
That's a crazy story. Never heard that one before.
Well, it's a true story. It's been one of those things that, and the details, some of the superfluous details I've gotten vague on, but the essence of everything I just told you is pretty much what happened. I could go back and maybe adjust the exact dates or whatever, which I'd like to know, but I probably never will be able to go back with that degree of precision and know on this date I got busted. It might be in the record somewhere, but all I know is that, yeah, by the end of the year, by the turning of 69 to 70, by 70, I knew I wasn't going. And it was because primarily of that. And there was one other thing which did not endear me, and that was that they gave you these forms, and on these forms they had these lists of organizations or anything that was suspect, right? Like if any anti-war organization would be on there, any left-leaning organization, probably any right-leaning organization if it was too extreme or whatever. But it was, and there were hundreds of them, right? Now I had been to some things that, I'd probably even been to some functions put on by, Marxists, Maoists. They were very prevalent during those years. You'd go out and there would be Maoists out on the street passing out literature, carrying their little red books, trying to give you their Mao's little red book, right? Where he And so you saw that a lot more prevalently out publicly than I do now. I don't ever see anybody out hawking Mao's Little Red Book. I can't remember the last time I saw that happen. But so I don't know. I just remember getting pissed off when I saw this because they wanted to know. They had this list, and you were supposed to go through the list and tell them um, if you'd ever been to any of their if you were a member of any of them, if you'd ever been to any of their meetings, if you knew people that belonged to it, if you'd ever received any of their literature, et cetera, et cetera. And I read that and I thought, that's none of your effing business. I don't need to tell you that. So in response, I took my pencil, and it's like 3 pages of this. And on each of the pages, I took my pencil and just scribbled out each page. Just, turned it over, scribbled it out. And I remember when I turned it in and the officer looks up, boy, did he, I could tell he was like, he wanted to beat me up right on the spot. But I figured, I'm in the moral right here, dude. I'm not obligated to tell anybody any of that. Not you, because you're an employee of the state. I'm not obligated to tell you any of this. Because at that point, I already was a firm believer in the First Amendment. Because you may not realize this, and a lot of people don't realize this, but the big advocates of First Amendment and freedom of speech in the 60s was the left, not the right. It was the right that was trying to censor things what was it acceptable to say about Vietnam or whatever else was going on. And it was the left. The whole free speech movement was born out of the left. So it's kind of flip-flopped. And it was the left that was anti-war. But you don't see it. So the left, today's left, is not the left of 50 years ago or 60 years ago at all. So we've had this weird flip-flop in American politics. But I guess there was a sort of a moral to all of this, I guess, a moral arc that I was following.
Well, kind of what I was getting from what you were saying is that in World War II, America came out of that with this moral authority. Like, we got attacked in Pearl Harbor. We were very justified in going to Germany, and we came out on the world stage with all this like moral currency. And then Vietnam comes around, and we kind of lost all that. The images and the media came out, and we just looked terrible, and we didn't have a really good reason to be there. And then things seemed to decline even further in the later wars, in the war in Middle East after 9/11. We spent 20 years there, and what do we have to show for it? The Taliban just took over right after we left. So now I think that we have negative moral authority on the world stage. It's like, if America gets involved in anything, it's seen as, we're going to fumble it, and we're just tampering with things, and it's very corrupt.
It's totally corrupt. I mean, it is totally corrupt. It's driven by vested interests. Big difference in Vietnam, though, was, the press was still relatively free back then. And so you had people like Larry Burroughs and, I can't remember her name. What was her? She was a French photographer, a little diminutive woman, but she did this amazing documentation because she was right out there with the troops. And Larry Burroughs, he ended up actually being killed when he was in a helicopter that got shot down I think it was over Cambodia. But when you see some of his photography, it's just, it's mind-blowing and heart-wrenching at the same time. When you look and you begin to see what's going on, I have a collection of some of his stuff I put together. I'm not sure if it's right at my fingertips or not, but when you see it, it really does drive home what was, he has photographs that were published in mainstream media. I'll give you an example. A tank coming in from the battlefield, and strewn over the top of this tank is probably a dozen dead Marines. Right? Now that shows up in mainstream media. We don't see anything like that now in our media. Not at all.
Well, now with social media, with the internet.
If it's going to show up, it's going to show up. That's where it's going to show up. That's exactly right. Not mainstream media anymore, right? But then that was mainstream media. Life magazine would have a photograph of Larry Burroughs. He was on a helicopter, and I was think it was the co-pilot. They were rescuing. They were bringing wounded off of the battlefield, and they were assaulted by, I think it was machine gunners there, in the heavy jungles. As they're taking off, the co-pilot gets shot, and the pilot. There's this famous photograph, and the pilot is turning and looking and seeing his companion there, his brother in arms, now who's just been horribly shot and dying before his eyes. And it is just an extremely powerful photograph. And this was on Life magazine. So this is like a major, you'd walk into a supermarket and there would be Life magazine. They made the decision post-Vietnam, in the Vietnam syndrome issue, is that, well, we have to now we can't control the narrative if you've got journalists that are free to roam at will, recording things. So there was a major shift that took place in the 80s, which is we're going to, in addressing the Vietnam syndrome, we're going to do that by getting control of the narrative. And one way we do that is we are now going to only allow journalists who are embedded. That means, in other words, that their movements are controlled. They're going to be within a group of servicemen and women who are basically assigned to that journalist. So it's the facade of journalism, but it's not really, because Larry Burroughs and these others, they were right there in the thick of the action firsthand. There was nobody vetting them. There was nobody saying, you can't take pictures of that, take pictures of this. And then deciding that which pictures were going to go out for public consumption. There was nobody doing that. Now it's totally controlled. This is a very important difference that people need to be aware of, see? And this is all deliberate to control the narrative. And so that's the casualty of war, is the truth. And of course, freedom. Now, I guess where I was getting at with this was in the aftermath of Vietnam. No, there was a burst of freedom. They dropped the draft. And I remember how the celebratory, the celebration that kind of swept across the country, that when we finally got out of Vietnam, the draft, the forcible conscription was done. We went to the volunteer army, but of course, that was again part of the plan as well. Because now, if you've got volunteers, the idea was, well, when you got draftees, they have no law. We're getting a bunch of people over there who don't want to be there, and so they're coming over there, and they're the ones coming back. A lot of them completely jaded, and this is all bullshit. Of course, a lot of them that were, like, I had he wasn't my friend, but I knew him well. I'd known him for years. He was in my high school. He was captain of the wrestling team. Very highly respected. He was one of the cool guys. I was, one of the uncool nerd type guys. But he was a cool guy, and I remember they would bring the recruiters, they'd bring the military recruiters into the high school, and they would set up a desk there, and they would start, trying to get people to sign up and volunteer. So there was a group of us that said, well, can we have the counter to that? Can we bring in somebody from whoever the anti-war group was to talk about the other side? And that never happened, but I remember we got this petition up, and I don't remember, we had 200 or 300 names on it, right? Trying to get some alternative to the military recruiter. Now, let me just say, I'm not anti-military. I want to make that clear. I'm not anti-military. We can come back to that discussion. But so this guy, his name was Rick. I remember him coming up one day, and he's saying, hey, he called me Carlson, hey, Carlson, hey, man, so he wanted to debate me about Vietnam, right? And basically saying, look, man, we got to go over there and we got to fight them over there, because if we don't fight them over there, we're going to be fighting them here. And I remember he and I having this debate, and I wasn't buying into any of that, because even at that point, I go, well, how are they going to get here? Are they going to get in, read boats and paddle across the Pacific Ocean? Or, they don't have a Navy and they don't have an Air Force. How are they going to get here? But we never did see eye to eye on that. So, we get out of high school. I don't know, I have no contact with him anymore because we weren't really friends. We were just acquaintances, right? Um, so then a few years go by. In fact, I think it was not, maybe by 1973. Yeah, in 1973, I'm working out in a suburb of Minneapolis. I've just started my contracting business, and I had contracted to build a record store for a kid that I knew who had become an entrepreneur, and he started a record store, and it was called Down in the Valley because what he did is he's rented this basement in a commercial building, and you went down these stairs, and he had all the cool records of all the cool bands in the early 70s and stuff, right? So I went in there uh, to do I wanted to buy some records. So he's in there, I don't remember his name, but he goes, "Hey, Carlson, yeah, what are you doing these days?" "Well, I'm working with my dad. We're doing some carpentry work." And he had this one section where he had records. He says, "Man, I've got all this space over here and I've got more records. I need shelves. Can I hire you to build these shelves?" And so I did. I'm building all of these shelves for my buddy there. We got to be friends before this was done. It was my first ever contracted job, was in Down in the Valley Records. So one day at lunch, I leave and I go I'm at the drugstore getting something. I don't know what, Band-Aids or whatever. I'm at a drugstore. I'm standing in the line. And now Rick, the captain of the wrestling team, when I last remembered him, he was very clean cut, definitely a jock, definitely, gung ho. I knew he was going to probably volunteer, head over, and we're standing in line. I hear, "Hey, Carlson, how you doing?" Something like that. And I turn around, and at first I didn't recognize him. Beard, kind of longish, curly hair. And then, "Oh, Rick." Yeah. And so it was him. So we got into this conversation. We went out. It was like on lunch hour. He was probably working on lunch hour, whatever. I don't know, but I can't remember that. But so we started talking, and he basically, the essence of it was, "Hey," he goes, "Do you remember when we had that debate or discussion, whatever?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, of course I remember that." He says, "Well, you were right. You were right." That's what he said to me.
Damn.
And now this is by 73. I do remember this was summer of 73. So by this time the war has been winding down. He'd gone over there, served his tour of duty, maybe even 2 tours, I don't know. He'd come back and he'd seen everything firsthand. And he came back convinced that it was bullshit. And it was bullshit. And that there was no point in us being there. That it was lose-lose for everybody involved. You know, what nobody knows, 1 million, 2 million Vietnamese civilians died in that war. I mean, we just, there was more ordnance dropped in that war on that than many times what was dropped in World War II. The defoliants that were spread over tens of thousands of acres. I mean, it just, and they have not fully recovered from the effects because there's still every year dozens of people are getting blown up from all the ordnance that got left behind, right? Birth defects from the defoliants that were being sprayed, the Agent Orange, all of this stuff that was, and of course, what are they doing? They're spraying the defoliants because, the jungles were providing cover for the Viet Cong to, maneuver and to carry supplies. And the idea was to sever the supply chain. So they sprayed huge amounts of defoliants over tens of thousands of acres in Vietnam. So, I mean, yeah, it was lose-lose for everybody. I mean, families got ripped apart because, their sons went over there and either didn't come back. Now, my friend, he was a year older than me. His name was Tom. We rode a bus together to school ever since first grade. We weren't really friends. We just had known each other, and then he had a younger brother that was maybe a little younger than me. And I knew he had gone over there, and I don't remember if it was a mutual friend or his brother that I ran into. And I said, "Well, how's Tom doing?" And then whoever it was that I was his friend or his little brother said, "Oh, well, he didn't come back." Well, he did come back. He was killed over in Vietnam. They told me, he was the rear gunner in a helicopter that got shot down, which was pretty shocking to me. And then whoever I was talking to said, yeah, they sent his remains home, but what came home wouldn't have even filled a shoebox.
Mm.
So why did they even bother? I remember that conversation very well. And I'm picturing he was a real nice kid, you know. And again, we weren't friends, but you know, he was a year, maybe 2 years older than me. But we had ridden the bus. They lived on a farm on the next crossroad from where I lived and grew up, you know. So anyhow, that was shocking to me. That was shocking. And that was one of the things that really, when you make that transition from, you know, child things to adult things, you know, what's the biblical verse there? Now you're putting away the child things and you're
I don't remember
focusing
that
on.
one. Um, yeah, it's crazy. I've been out to Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, that whole area, and they're still really feeling the effects of the things that went on there in the 60s and 70s. And yeah, it's you kind of forget how that's fairly recent. You know, it's within the generation of the older people there, and that's
Yep.
taken quite a toll. But thank you for that history lesson there, and it's really great to hear the firsthand experience. And
Well, the thing that is, I guess, the takeaway from it is what I guess is all of this is surrounding is the three pillars I'm talking about: peace, freedom,
yes,
and truth.
and yeah, you need all three. If you lose one, you kind of start to lose the others.
And that's what we're in the middle of. Maybe we'll see some restoration. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. We certainly did not have that in the last 4 years. What we had was pretty much a full-blown effort to have complete control of the narrative and to keep everybody who would be perhaps asking too many questions totally distracted with a bunch of invented issues like, you know, like the whole pronoun thing and the gender
Mm-hmm.
thing and, you know, all of the stuff, the DEI, all of that, which was designed to distract the minds of young people and keep them distracted and, you know, to control their priorities so they're not questioning policies being implemented that are going to really dramatically affect their future for the rest of their lives.
Right.
Let's
We
not
we have
have
a
that.
we have a friend in common, Matt Lohmeyer, who
Yeah,
did quite some good work, and now it's amazing. It's like the Hermetic principles. First, he was kicked out of the military for pointing this stuff
yeah.
out, and now it's come full circle where he's now back in a position of power. I think he's the Secretary of the Air Force.
Undersecretary of the Air Force. Yes.
So
And
yeah,
I'm
it's
like two
beautiful to
thumbs
see.
up.
Yeah.
And like I said before, I'm not anti-military. I'm anti making the military a tool of the politicians to pursue their own agendas or vested interests, which is what's happened. Our military has been captured as part of this foreign interventionist foreign policy that's all about perpetuating the agendas of a small elite in our society. I'm against that. To me, being against that is being pro-military. Now, I think we need to shift back towards the original ideas, and we don't need to talk about that today, but I think an important discussion we need to have is what should our foreign policy be? And what should our military policy be? And I think right there, if we go back to the geniuses that founded this country, although they weren't perfect, we acknowledge all of that, right? But they were nonetheless endowed with a vision and a genius, and they gave us something that if we could stick to the original principles, I think that would be no system is perfect, but I think that would be the system that comes as close as we can possibly get to the highest ideals. Um, and again, I mean, it's enshrined in our Declaration, it's enshrined in the Bill of Rights, and so on. That's what we need to be protecting, and our homeland. But I mean, so in a way, you know, we are being invaded, have been invaded ever, you know, in the last 4 years. What is it? Between 8 and 10 million illegals have come into the country since Biden took office. And I'm all in favor of people, you know, look, I have had a business for years and have worked with immigrants, and I love immigrants. But this thing has degenerated into something completely different. It's provided a cover for forces that we really don't want in our country. Forces that are coming in that have the worst intentions as far as America go. And they're having an open door to come in and do what? Who knows? But so I'm not anti-immigrant. I'm pro-immigrant, but it's got to be done in some kind of a coherent, organized fashion. So, but of course, a lot of the bad element that's coming in is, in a way, the byproduct of our continuous interventions over the last 3, 4, 5 decades. The disruption that's occurred in Venezuela, for example. I mean, we've deliberately destroyed, well, with the help of the communists, between the communists and our own government, destroying the economy of Venezuela. So out of that now is all of this secondary consequences that into criminal behavior and so forth. A lot of those Venezuelan criminals have made their way into North America, into America. That's just well established. So the question we have to be asking is, and I think it's in the context of all these other issues that you and I are interested in, where does America go from here? And I think what Trump, I don't think he has a clear idea of where we could go, but what he has done, and I certainly don't agree with everything he's talking about, not by a long shot, but what he has done is he's shaken things up. And things were just getting too ossified, too fossilized. The deep state blob was just getting too entrenched. This is shaking all that up. And what that's going to do is it's going to create cracks within this imposing edifice that was being forced onto our society. And it's going to create opportunities for freedom-loving young people to grab the reins. And what's going to happen 4 years from now? Are we going to go back to Bidenomics? Or are we going to move ahead to the next thing beyond where we're at now? And I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to go back to DEI. I don't want to go back to socialism. I don't want to go back to everybody, as many people as possible, being dependent upon the almighty state. That's not the American way. The American way is independence. It's self-reliance. It's local communities is where the core of the political decisions take place, not in far distant Washington, where we're 3 or 4 or 5 degrees removed from any real influence as to what goes down there. I think what Trump is doing is going to create opportunities. And I'm just hoping that people your age and younger and, 40 and down and the young people coming up will understand that. Too many of them are like looking at the propaganda and, oh, he's a rapist, he's a racist, he's a misogynist, all of this stuff, to where, look, stop for a minute and think what you're doing. It's like all the other side needs to do is make an accusation, and then you've got this whole group of people that just grab it and run with it as if it's the absolute verified truth. And they build this whole mindset around that. And it's been constructed. It's part of the deliberate campaign of propaganda. Got to shake them out of that and say, look, you need to step back for a minute. But I think from what I've seen, Mark, of your generation and younger, is that there is a core of you guys that totally get it. Totally get it. And I want to see those numbers grow. And because from here on, see, let's talk about this. We've got a possibility in America that's unprecedented now. In fact, I think we're standing at an inflection point in the history of life on Earth, because we are now poised, life on Earth is now poised to become cosmic. Life has been seeded here from the cosmos. I mean, I think that's becoming more and more obvious. Those seeds have taken root and have flowered into all of these diverse species that this planet is capable of sustaining. And out of these species, this gets back to what we first started talking about. One species has developed through whatever, whether it's divine intervention or evolution or some combination thereof, we've developed the power of reason. we can now look out into the universe and we can understand the mechanisms, the workings of creation in a way that, no other species can. Now, there have been we know that of 14 other species of hominids that we've either cohabitated the earth with or existed on the planet just before the rise of Homo sapiens sapiens, which is you and me and all the rest of the people that we consider human. But at least 13 other species of bipedal hominids didn't succeed. You understand, we're like the last man standing out of like 14 species of hominids, which I believe all was part of the evolutionary imperative to develop the larger brains with the larger cognitive functions that go along with it. We're the last man standing. Now, it comes down to us, because what will happen is we now know that this planet is subjected to periodic catastrophes. We know that before we came along, 99, and this is probably conservative, 99.99% of all species that ever existed on this planet are extinct. Well, how did they go extinct? The old model, which really is becoming obsolete, is that you had this gradual incremental process of Darwinian evolution. And you have species A and species B. They're distinct species because they cannot reproduce. They cannot, generate offspring, right? Once that degree of separation has occurred, now you have two different species. But somewhere between there, you should have countless other gradational species where you get from A to B. In fact, maybe it's A to M, and you have to go through B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L to get to M, right? But this has been the problem with Darwinian evolution. The incrementalist model of evolution is where are those transitional species? They are conspicuous by their absence. What we have is more like quantum jumps, right? But the quantum jumps only come in the aftermath of catastrophic mass extinction events. So if we look at the history of life on Earth, we see proliferation of life, like going back to the Cambrian, and you see species just proliferating. If you look at the spikes, they go way up, and then all of a sudden, just truncated. 75%, 3/4 of all species on Earth, terrestrial and marine, are suddenly gone, right? You're looking in the fossil record, and it's just loaded with fossils of all these diverse types of creatures, let's say in the oceans. And then all of a sudden, 75-80% of them are gone. And now you have this long hiatus. Maybe in geological terms, it's not so long, but you've got this hiatus. At the end of that hiatus, all of a sudden, you've got this spike where all of these new species are showing up over a very short period of time. The paleontologists refer to it as rapid speciation. What's driving it? I don't know. But we now have a pretty good idea what drove those drops. It was catastrophes. And I think that these catastrophes, the bulk of them, are being driven by cosmic forces. And ultimately, there's a whole school of thought, and I pretty much subscribe to it, that, you've got multiple different kinds of catastrophes. Exogenic from outside, endogenic from inside the planet. Exogenic, the two big ones in my mind would be cosmic impacts and solar storms, proton events, etc. Those two things are the two primary things that I think have affected the Earth from the outside. But I also suspect, and I think there's a body of evidence to support this, that these outer ones are actually what is influencing the inner responses. So let's say that there's a mantle overturning event, or a what's called an anoxic event in the ocean, or a spasm of volcanism, or a spasm of seismic activity. What it's looking like is that's being largely triggered from outside. So major impact on the Earth associated. We know that at least 5 of the great mass extinctions have simultaneously had impacts and huge eruptions of volcanoes. And I think that, like, for example, the Permian Triassic, 90 to 95% of all species, marine and terrestrial, went extinct. You have evidence that's not conclusive, but very strong evidence that there was at least one or two very large impacts, and you had the extrusion of the Siberian traps, which was toxic volcanism, spreading over tens of thousands of square miles, gigantic floods of basaltic lava, extruding sulfur compounds and all kinds of things into the atmosphere. At the KT boundary, when the dinosaurs went extinct, you had at least one major impact, probably two. There was probably one in the Indian Ocean. You had multiple smaller ones clustered around that KT boundary. Well, you also had the extrusion of the Deccan traps in India. Same thing. See, we could go on. So the point, we're poised now, to understand that in terms of our thinking about a species on planet Earth, we have to be thinking in terms of a cosmic ecosystem. We are literally part of a cosmic ecosystem, and any kind of an ecology that does not recognize these much larger forces is really pretty much meaningless. We have to recognize that impacts from things from space, comets, asteroids, whether they're comets, low density, asteroids, high density like metal, carbonaceous chondrites right in the middle of the spectrum, each of these has a different effect when it strikes the Earth. And I think that we're just at the really beginning to understand the biological effects of what happens when you have, let's say, a very large intrusion of platinum group metals into the biosphere, for example. But my point is, I think we're on this inflection point right now. We're poised to become a cosmic species. And essentially, have we been here before? That's another question. We won't get into that right now. But we're here now. We know that we're in a unique geological epoch called the Holocene. It's now considered to be 11,600 years old. 11,600 years ago, there was some kind of a major transition, a sudden abrupt transition in the continuum of life on Earth and the climate on Earth. Because look, at 11,600 years ago, there was something called meltwater pulse 1b, right? Gigantic pulse of meltwater into the world's oceans. Where did that come from? Well, from melting ice. But in order to have a meltwater pulse, you have to be able to melt a whole lot of ice very, very quickly. This happened at least twice, I think 3 times, to get us out of the Ice Age, right? Completely rearranged the planetary landscape, the planetary climate, which is now very, very different from what it was 15,000 years ago.
Randall, how fast was that melting? How quickly did all that ice melt?
Okay, that very good question. The whole process from start to finish was about 5,000 or 6,000 years. However, it was not uniform within that span of time. You can't take and go, okay, it was 6,000 years, and we had 6 million cubic miles of ice, which is about what it was during the late glacial maximum here, and interglacial, all of that's gone. So 6,000 years, 6 million, that means 1 million cubic miles of ice, on average, has to melt every 1,000 years. But see, even within that, it wasn't uniform. There were spikes. We know that, for example, during the Younger Dryas, one of the now questions is, did the melting stop altogether? Did the glaciers stabilize for 1,300 years? Did they start growing again for 1,300 years until the end of the Younger Dryas? Well, if it's the latter, if they started growing, think about that, what that does to the continuum of melting. See, so we're now realizing that, scientists realized in the 1970s that the amount of energy required to melt that volume of ice is extraordinary. And there was not enough energy in any known system to melt that ice in 6 or even 10,000 years. So the timelines had to be completely revised from assuming, 50,000 years to get rid of the ice. No, you've only got 10,000 years, and now it's looking more like 6,000 years, 7,000 years.
Yeah, because
Yes.
when I look at the graph of the Younger Dryas with the meltwater pulse 1A and pulse 1B, it
Hmm.
looks like an extremely sharp, rapid incline and decline.
It
And
is.
I'm not
Yes.
sure how. I mean, from the looks of it from that graph, the line is almost straight up, which makes me think that this happened in like just a few years, the
Yes.
melting.
Well, I think it did. I think those meltwater pulses were the result of catastrophic, instantaneous, virtually melting. And, in the tours that I've been doing, I mean, that's very much about reading and deciphering the landscapes that were created through these gigantic melting events. I mean, when we go out to the Scablands and we look at we tour those coulees, Grand Coulee and Moses Coulee, and we look at the Channel Scablands and all of that, the recessional cataracts and the gigantic boulder bars and things. Well, yeah, these are peak discharges that are orders of magnitude beyond anything that we've experienced, since recorded history began, much less modern times when scientists first started documenting these kind of processes. I mean, I, I don't know if you were aware of you knew there was all this horrible flooding in western North Carolina in the fall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And well, it was about 100-year flood. I mean, the last time a flood of a similar magnitude occurred was in 1916. And there hadn't been a flood of that magnitude since 1916. But some of those peak discharges that occurred, like, they took some of the measurements, like overflowing some of the dams and stuff. But essentially, the peak discharge was like 20,000 cubic feet per second. That's a lot of water. I mean, that's enough water it can wash. If it's moving 25, 30 miles an hour, it can, or even 15 miles, it can wash away a house. It can pick up an automobile and move it, right? 20,000 cubic feet per second. If you go to Grand Coulee, no, let's go up to Spokane Valley. The meltwater flow that came through Spokane Valley, which is just there between the city of Spokane, Washington, and Lake Pend Oreille in northern Idaho, that flow that came through there may have been as much as 800 million cubic feet per second. Now, let me just put in 800 here. Let's see, 800,000, 1, 2, 3, there's 800 million. Divide by 20,000. And what you get is that was 40,000 times the flow.
Wow.
Now, try to wrap your head around that. Now, that was one flow that occurred at the end of the Ice Age in this gigantic series of meltings that removed 6 million cubic miles of ice from the surface and put it back into the oceans of the world, causing ocean levels worldwide to rise 400 feet or more. And imagine what that did to the coastlines. I mean, obviously the coastlines are not stationary when the sea level's coming up 400 feet, are they? No, in fact, when the Ice Age came on, and you dropped sea levels by 400, maybe as much as 450 feet, coastlines move seaward and expose, that around the planet, we have all these shallow continental shelves, right? You've seen the maps. Well, what happens then is that those continental shelves get exposed to the atmosphere, and as the centuries go by, you've got a whole new ecosystem, a terrestrial ecosystem that reclaims what had been a shallow marine environment, right? And roughly, very roughly, the amount of land area exposed by the dropping sea levels is roughly in the ballpark of the amount of land that is now swallowed up by the expanding glaciers. So it's almost like this trade-off. Now, if you were a member of a culture that was existing during the Ice Age, and you're looking for optimum place to live and to create a settlement or a village or even an urban area, well, coastlines are going to be one of your obvious choices, right? Now, not so much if the sea levels are rising or falling. You don't want to build on the coastline if sea levels are rising, obviously. It's going to drown. If you build on the coastline when sea levels are falling, all your docks, if it's a port using it as a port, now you're left high and dry, right? So it's got to be in a time in that process where sea level is more or less stable, like it is now, more or less, right? But so if we go back 15,000 years ago, 16,000, 20,000 years ago, and we drop sea levels 400 feet, coastlines are dozens to hundreds of miles further seaward, right, than they are now. The proximity of the oceans ameliorates climatic change, right? I mean, think of the difference between Newfoundland and England. Think about a winter in the UK compared to Newfoundland. Newfoundland is going to be extremely cold. You're going to have many days below zero, all kinds of snow. Not so much in England, right? Why? Because the Gulf Stream is just carrying that warm air, the warm water is coming up there and dispensing its heat up there. And the Western North American continent is not receiving that water. It's going over to Europe. And Europe, Northwestern Europe, is getting the benefit of that warmth that's being conveyed up there, right? So the point is, if you're going to build a town, a city, a village, a hamlet, a settlement of any kind during the Ice Age, one of the prime habitable real estate areas is going to be your coastlines. Well, what's going to happen at the end of the Ice Age then? When sea levels come up 400 feet?
It's gone.
It's gone. It's gone. It's gone. That's right. And that is part of what the problem is, I think, with modern archaeology, is that modern archaeology is not yet, I think that's starting to shift. But you have the old guard, the gatekeepers, and we know who they are, right? Who completely dismiss the idea of there being anything other than, subsistence farmers or nomadic hunter-gatherers, basically barbarians, if you go back into prehistory, right? That there couldn't have been any advanced civilization because we know that they were all essentially savages, living hand to mouth, etc. And that's kind of the dominant, that's oversimplified, of course, but that's the dominant model. That's the dominant paradigm about prehistory. Well, that's being called into question constantly now because there's so many things that don't fit that model, which is basically you've got this nice logarithmic curve that goes along for tens of thousands of years, maybe a little blip here and there, but, then all of a sudden, 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, it starts this upward arc. And actually it starts on the upward arc 8 to 10,000 years ago, and then it just suddenly takes off 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. And here we are now at the pinnacle of this. And so in that model, there's no room for anybody in the prehistoric past that had any, like what we might call scientific awareness or looking at the world that way, or to have created a culture that could have been in its own way comparable to the sophistication and advancement and knowledge of natural law as we are today. But as soon as you begin to open to that possibility, a lot of things begin to make sense that otherwise within the dominant paradigm don't make sense. See? One of those is catastrophes, because most archaeologists are not hip to how profoundly this planet has been remodeled on a regular basis. Now, there was one point I wanted to make, and then I'm going to rest for a minute while you talk, but I'll say this. I pointed out that 11,600 years ago is now the transition from Pleistocene to Holocene. So we say Holocene, 11,600 years old. Pleistocene, well, it started between 2.5 and 2.6 million years ago. So here's the Pleistocene, and here's the Holocene. The question is the Holocene really a distinct epoch? Completely so distinct that it's not even part of the 2.5 million years. We have to come up with a whole new geological term for it. Or is it really just another interval within this? Which is what I tend to think. But if we go back and we look during all of this and we try to find periods that were equivalent to our own in terms of the warmth and the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, that would create an environment that would be compatible with agriculture, for example. What do we find? Well, we find these discrete intervals, and none of them have lasted more than, say, 10,000 years. So it's like if we look at the predecessors of the Holocene, these interglacial periods, they're the exception, not the rule. What does that mean? I think that has implications. Number one, the last analog to the Holocene that's accepted as such is called the Eemian. The Eemian period lasted from, let's say, 116,000 years ago to 129,000. It was 13,000 years long. So it was about a millennia longer than the Holocene. Yet within the Eemian, there was extraordinary changes going on. In terms of, it was warmer than now. If I pulled up a graph here and showed you some of this, it's really quite striking when you see it. And I think I probably should here, just for the sake of something else. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so
Yeah, let's check it out.
yeah. Okay, so
So when I think one of my first videos that I ever got introduced to you through was a video of you describing how humans have been around for 200,000 years, yet we only have recorded history on about 5,000-6,000 years. So what happened in that? We were missing 95+% of our story, and
yes,
you showed how there has been at least 16 events in that time where there had been a global catastrophe on a level that would destroy every major city on Earth.
well, or at least, yeah, that let's refine it a little. Not well, ultimately, yes, but we have to picture that a lot of these catastrophes are not just singular events. Some of them are. Like a big impact is a singular event that causes immediate, instantaneous destruction. However, the consequences, secondary consequences of such an event could persist for decades, even centuries. In fact, I would go so far as to speculate that a lot of the volcanic activity and seismic activity that we experience today on the planet is still the aftermath of what happened in the Younger Dryas. And the adjustment, the adjustment of the planet to this new equilibrium that prevailed coming out of the Younger Dryas. But go on.
Yeah, and I really appreciated going on the Scablands trip with you and the Southwest tour with you, and it was so clear that the landscapes that we were looking at didn't just happen gradually, like you said, one grain of sand, one drop of water at a time.
Right.
These landscapes were shaped in a very violent way, and they were ripped apart. You see these erratic boulders that have been carried 100 miles from where they originally were in the mountain, and they were stripped on a piece of ice the size of an oil tanker and then dropped down somewhere else in some farmer's field. That stuff, it really sticks with you. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, are there any other locations on Earth like the Scablands where we can see the scars of a catastrophe?
Oh, yes. Now, one of the reasons that I hold the Scablands in such high regard is because they are one of the places, and I've said this to the tours and just in conversation in lectures and so on, that the Channel Scablands sort of represents one of the most spectacular incarnations on the planet of catastrophic events. Okay? But in other cases, they're there, but you don't recognize them. You don't understand them for what they are. And I can actually, we might as well go ahead and look at some images here. And let me pull up. Yeah, here we are. Now, were you on the trip where we visited this gully here?
Oh, yeah.
Here's a perfect example. If you're walking over the surface, you've got people now that have been farming this area for generations. You've got towns, you've got roads. You've got this whole world agriculture, we're looking out onto the fields there. We see their cultivated fields. There's a whole world that exists on top of this landscape. But to 99% of the people that live on this landscape, what's under the surface, they have no knowledge of. But when you look at this, what you're seeing here is evidence of gigantic surges of sediment-laden floodwater that backflooded onto this landscape, surge after surge, and that's what these layers are. Let's go here. Here's another. Now, this is in the Yakima Valley, and this is in the Pasco Basin, which is 100 miles away, or 150 miles away. Yet it's the same flood depositing these as these. And so here's a layer. Each of these they're called rhythmites. So picture this, what you're looking at here. Imagine that you've got this big flood and it's coming down. You've got a main valley, the trunk valley, right? Coming in on that, you have tributary valleys coming in from all kinds of directions that are carrying smaller rivers or creeks or streams, as the case may be. And I'm going to actually open another window here so we can really get into this. I'm going to pull up some Google Maps, and I'm going to go to terrain view, because this is part of, I think, the inflection point that we're on right now. Because one of the things that we are able to do now that previous generations weren't able to do is to perceive this imprint, this overprint of these great catastrophes and how they're preserved in the landscape. So I'm just going to open Google Maps, so we'll jump over to that in a second. I'm going to just zoom out here, and I'll probably head over here to right over here to the Scablands. Okay, so now imagine this, Mark. You've got this trunk valley. You've got this main flow coming down through the valley. Now you've got valleys, tributary valleys coming in on the sides. Well, when that flow comes down the main valley, and let's say, at least like in the case of the Scablands, some of those trunk valleys were carrying 500 to 800 feet of water, right? So now, normally, your river's down here. You get this big flood, even if it's a modern day flood and it's only 10 or 20 feet above the floodplain. What happens is it backfloods. The water flows up the tributary valleys. Now, you know that the velocity of water depends on the gradient. The steeper the gradient, the faster the water flows. The faster the water flows, the more erosive it is. Okay, that just makes common sense, right? Now, if you've got water back surging up a tributary valley, well, it's now moving against the gradient. So what it's doing, it's not accelerating, it's decelerating until it finally reaches the limit. Let's say that the trunk valley, it's 100 feet deep. Well, now it backfloods up and it those surges fill the tributary valleys up to that 100-foot water level. However, when you get to the distal end or reach of that back surge, the water is losing momentum as it moves up gradient, right? So far, you're with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's slowing down the whole time. Now, this water is filled with sediment. That's what floods do. They erode and they pick up lots of sediment, right? That water slows down, eventually stops, and when the water level in the main valley drops, then the tributary can begin to drain out. As it drains out, it leaves a calling card behind in the form of a layer of mud. And that's what you're looking at right here in this image. Each of these was a separate back surge loaded with sediment, moved into the Yakima Valley, ponded, and then reversed current and flowed out. Now, go to the next slide. This is very interesting here. These are your rhythmites in the Yakima Valley. And you see that white stuff?
Mm-hmm.
That's volcanic ash. So in between the deposition of this rhythmite here, if you can see my cursor, and the one on top of it, you had In fact, we can identify where this ash came from. It came from Mount St. Helens. So what you had is this belching forth, a huge volcanic eruption from Mount St. Helens, and that ash settled in this ponded water and filtered down to the bottom. And then the next surge came in, and because the water is moving slow at this point, it's not very erosive. Now, it certainly washes away some of the ash, but it leaves a remnant of that ash behind that we can now look at and go, yes, Mount St. Helens was undergoing a very large, violent eruption during these floods. Okay? Now, here's the point, I guess we'll go back to this.
So these things seem to happen simultaneously. Like one catastrophe triggers a set another one.
You're
like
getting,
a comet
yeah.
will trigger a volcano, which will trigger an earthquake, which will trigger, yeah.
That's the idea here. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, and what's happening here with these meltwater floods is you're having a gigantic mass transfer from ice piled up 1.5 miles thick on the continent that's rapidly melting. So you've got this unloading, this massive glacial unloading that's taking place, and this huge transfer of mass, right? The crust of the earth has to respond to that. And this is what we're seeing here. In fact, we can document, I don't have it handy, but we could document that there were extremely big earthquakes also occurring during this time. If you go up by Hudson Bay, around Hudson Bay, there are shorelines that are raised up to, I think, as much as 1,500 feet above modern sea level. Those were shorelines that were once at sea level, but they were under the core of the great glaciers, 1.5 miles thick. When you remove those, the land starts rebounding, and it has risen by, 1,500 feet or so. So now it's above, and so you've got these rings of shorelines that you can see around the rim of Hudson Bay, right? So that's called isostatic adjustment or isostatic compensation. So when that, in the early stages of that, yeah, you're going to have all kinds of stuff happening, volcanically and seismically, earthquakes and so on. Now, as that process continues, the intensity of those the volcanism and the seismicity and so forth will decline, right? But I think we can look at the last 10 to 11,600 years and we can see that I think that there has been a sort of a declining status of these secondary events. That's why I say I think it's very possible that a lot of the volcanic eruptions that are going on today and some of the earthquakes might be residual from the transitions that occurred 11, 12, 13,000 years ago. But here's a takeaway point. You can look at let's say Dry Fault Cataract, which I think we went to. But you're seeing here, this is not obvious. Back in the 1930s, there was an irrigation pipe, that big irrigation pipe with high pressure water in it had busted. So it was weeks before they could get it contained, and that water gushing out cut this 130 foot deep, 150 foot deep gully here through this landscape and exposed these rhythmites. Well, the first thing was wondered what's going on here. Well, after studying, these are flood deposits here, right? But you have generations of people living and working on top of this without having any idea of the story that's under their feet. You see what I'm getting at here? So once you understand that, this is very much a contrast. Let's say, if I can go back here to some of the more extraordinary, okay, like this thing here, right? This is Potholes Cataract. I think we went there, right? So if you look at this, this is an extraordinary erosional feature. You got 400-foot cliffs here. Water came from the right, began downcutting. You can see these Finger Lakes here is where the water began eating its way into the basalt. And then it came up to this ridge, and it poured over this ridge here. Because before the flood came on, see this line here? That line was continuous across here. It wasn't, in fact, it wasn't as steep as it is now. Um, but you had this huge rush of water that came from the east. It overpoured this ridge, and as this water's pouring over, picture this. It's pouring over this rim like this, right? So it's creating all of these shear forces on this cliff face and on the transition from horizontal to vertical, right? Well, as it's doing that, it's eroding and eating away this rock face, so the cliff face is migrating up current, right? And so this is called a recessional cataract because it's being formed, it's receding as the water flows over it and eats its way back upstream. And it would have continued to do that as long as the source of the floodwaters were continuous. But when the floodwaters stopped, when the spigots were turned off, wherever that state of erosion was, got locked into place, and that became a feature, a fossilized feature in the landscape. And that's what you've got here, this gigantic fossilized feature. Now, this is an example of something that is very prominent. And in fact, in 1910, J. Harlan Bretz, who's kind of the godfather of 20th century catastrophic flood studies, with his studies of this area, newly published 7.5 quadrangle maps of the U.S. Geological Survey were published in 1910. One of the maps was the first mapping of this feature we're looking at right here, Potholes Cataract. J. Harlan Bretz liked to study geological maps, so he procured the latest geological maps. This feature was in there, and he started looking at it, and the more he looked at it, the more perplexed he got. Like, what the hell is happening here? Well, that's what actually set him off on his 50-year quest that led him into this theory of these gigantic floods. Now, here's back to your question. There are spectacular features and there are subdued features. Now, the whole world is not engraved with spectacular features. But once you know that whole continuum from subdued to spectacular and everything in between, you realize that large swaths of the Earth's surface bear the imprints of gigantic catastrophic events. Absolutely. The answer to your question is yes, indeed there is. In Europe, there are tunnel valleys. Now, tunnel valleys are not unlike these things right here, like these Finger Lakes. And they're huge. They're huge. And they're northwestern Europe. They were formed the same way. You know, the drumlin fields, which are very interesting, which I think are going to be one of the key parts of the grammar of catastrophism that is going to teach us a whole lot about what actually transpired on this planet that erased 180 or 200,000 years of history and gave us and birthed the modern world that we've inherited. But here's, I think, one of the insights that we have to take away from this. Like I said, the Holocene of warm interglacial warmth is the exception, not the rule. And I think it's important that we recognize that. And we've already exceeded what we would expect for an interglacial period by at least a millennium or two. So is that something that that we should be factoring into our long-range thinking? I think it is. I think it's that we need to recognize that 99.99% of all species have become extinct because of cosmic catastrophes. And what that does is lead us to the realization that we are we're vulnerable. As long as we're a species confined to a surface of a planet, we are vulnerable to cosmic catastrophe. And the only way to make ourselves invulnerable, I think, is to become a cosmic civilization. And what does that mean? Well, it means that's going to give us an opportunity to convert all the technologies that we've developed for war for the development or the peaceful and economic development and colonization and exploitation of the infinite resources of space. And that's the direction we need to go. And the resources in terms of material and energy, once we're outside the Earth, are so vast it's almost incomprehensible. And we're now poised to where we could become a spacefaring civilization long before you get old. Within a generation, we could within 10 years if the vision and the will was there. And I think it's going to take another, perhaps a small cosmic impact to shock the human species out of their stupor and their hypnotic trance and realize that we're here to do something. We're here on Earth. We evolved, life on Earth evolved the human species to do something. And that is to create a species that has the ability to protect and preserve all the other species that we coexist on this planet with. And in the event of another cosmic impact, well, we're the only species that can do anything to ameliorate that, if not prevent it altogether. So why are we sitting on our asses worrying about, what pronouns we're going to use or, I mean, come on, people.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I remember what you said about the comment Shoemaker Levy 9, how we were able to predict its impact, like a stream of impacts on Jupiter. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, if we were able to forecast an impact on Earth, maybe we had a month out. We have a month before this impact hits. What could we practically do to protect ourselves if we had a month to prepare? Do we have the tools to defend ourselves?
Well, that's a great question. Okay. But there's a lot of variables we have to think about here. Because are we talking about an impactor that's the size of the Chelyabinsk, roughly 50 meters in diameter, that exploded over Siberia back in, over the town of Chelyabinsk in February of 2013?
2013. Yeah. Well, let's say this is 10 times bigger than that. This is a city destroyer. This is a multi-city destroyer asteroid coming at us.
Like the one that came right by within a whisker, a cosmic whisker back, I think it was June of last summer.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, people are oblivious to that. But, well, no, see, it all depends on how much lead time we have.
So let's say we had a month.
There's not much we can do in a month.
Really?
Not now. I mean, 10 years from now, yes, we could be prepared. We could have the systems in place to respond to that. Yes, we could. But right now, no, we don't. That's what I'm saying. We're vulnerable at this point.
Well, it seems like the right people are at Space Force now, or at least
yes.
One friend is, and hopefully they talk to you and get you in there, because maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like all we have to do is just shoot something out there that hits the asteroid and just nudges it off course a little bit, and something that could save us.
I think that's coming to be the most workable idea. In fact, actually, you could just attach a booster to it if you had enough lead time. Just attach a booster to it and nudge it a little bit, because then a direct hit could become a complete miss. But again, it all depends on lead time. This thing that flew by the Earth last summer, we had 2 weeks of lead time. That wouldn't have been enough to do anything if it was.
Was that part of the Tord?
I don't think so. No, I don't think it was. For one, well, I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe. Maybe.
Well, you've done a great job of banging the drum on this issue, because I hear every time Joe Rogan does a podcast, I hear him talking about this. And it's one of the big issues that I think a lot more people are becoming aware of, thanks to you.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
There is another thing I wanted to talk to you about that I recently heard you mention on a video about the moon. Could we talk about the moon?
Sure. Let's talk about the moon.
So I haven't looked into this too deeply, but I heard you mention that the moon could be hollow.
Well, that's an oversimplified model. There is this school of thought out there, the moon is hollow. And that goes back really to the Apollo days. And but let's put it this way: there is a lot of the moon is a relatively low density object, and what that means is there's probably lots of voids within the moon. That's very likely. That might be, to me, the best way to explain the nature of the moon. And I guess I could go ahead and pull up a few things here that we could look at. So let's see, is this what you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, this looks good.
So, but if we talk about it, Mark, it's not going to be hidden anymore, is it? When you are deciding to walk the path of knowledge and you're going to penetrate the ancient mysteries, the first admonition imposed upon you is this: what's he doing there? What's going on in this image?
I see an RC. Is that for Randall Carlson?
No, that's just a coincidence.
um, let's see.
I had nothing to do with the creation of this. There. Okay, look, what's this up here at the top?
That's a cross.
And what else? There's something else going on there.
Is this in the moonlight?
It's a rose.
Okay.
Now, are you at your computer? Can you do this? Look up the Latin phrase sub rosa, and then tell me what it says.
Sub rosa, happening or done in secret.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
But you'll notice he's knocking at the door at the same time he's going shh. See, I started looking into the mysteries 50 years ago. 50 years ago. I don't exaggerate, 50 years ago. And I soon realized that there are some things that are best left unsaid until the time is right. And so there are certain things that I encountered, and I didn't know necessarily whether I would put my 100% confidence in them. This is now going back 30 years ago, 35 years ago. A couple of things simultaneously. By immersing myself in the myths and legends and folklore of old, and coming to the conclusion that, wait a second, this isn't the ravings of a pre-scientific, totally illiterate mind of savages and barbarians that are, conjuring up these stories about origins of the universe and origins of humans and great floods and great fires and angelic presences and gods and demons and all of this, that all of these are just the extrusions of a deranged mind that's projecting stuff onto the night sky out of fear, et cetera, et cetera. The old, shall we say, the obsolete 20th century version of prehistoric mind. Well, I began to have serious doubts about that 35, 40, 45 years ago, about that model, right? Then coming to believe that the traditions, the legacy of inherited traditions that we've now got access to from all over the world, from many, many cultures, from many different historical epochs and so on, we're in a position now, in a unique position, where we can decipher those on a level now and within the last, say, quarter century, the last generation, say, in a way that nobody was able to do for, who knows, 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 years. So now we go back and we see that, I showed you that map. J. Hallenbrath saw that map in 1910. It triggered something up here. It raised such profound questions in his mind that he went on a lifelong quest to get to the bottom of, what am I seeing here? So what he did was he gave us this legacy of profound, catastrophic, biblical scale floods fought against the establishment for 2 generations. They finally had to come and accept the reality. What they've tried to do now is straitjacket. We won't get into the details of that because I've covered it in depth elsewhere. Certainly reserves a revisit because we're constantly learning new things. But we're in a perspective now that we're beginning to see things. The earth is revealing, it's yielding up its secrets to us in a way that was never available before. See? And within this new framework of thinking, this new paradigm, yes, we have to go back and reconsider pretty much everything. And just as we can look at the ancient stories now and see that, well, why is there over 100 cultures that have stories about gigantic floods that almost wiped out the human race and left a straggling group of survivors that become the ancestors of this particular cultural group? And we find that theme over and over and over again. Well, now we understand it. Yeah, planetary scale movement of water is real. It has happened. It's happened multiple times. And it's caused the mass extinction of species. In fact, the evidence is now pointing to the fact that maybe we, the human species, came within a hair's breadth of extinction during the Younger Dryas and the surrounding episodes. Okay? Half the megafaunal species on Earth didn't make it across that boundary. You know that, right? You know this incredible bestiary of the mammoths and the giant ground sloths and the dire wolves and the saber-toothed cats and the woolly rhinos and on and on and on. Half of the megafaunal species on Earth did not survive over that threshold. Now, we now realize that events that are catastrophic enough, you mentioned it, catastrophic enough to basically cause a complete reset of civilization, happen far more frequently than anybody had realized a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations ago. Now, one of the things that you know that, for example, if you're living on the coast of Florida and a big hurricane is coming. Now, 100 years ago, there was no radar. You couldn't turn the radio on or the internet and get the latest update of where the hurricane is moving. You pretty much had to sit there, and when it came, you had to ride it out. And this is one reason why so many orders of magnitude more people were killed in hurricanes 100 years ago than now, right? So, but what's the main strategy? You know, I was just down in Florida, down there near Tampa in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian that had come through, right? The devastation was incredible. But so you know that this hurricane is coming, right? And you live on the coast. What are you probably going to do? What do you
Just
think?
hunker down.
Well, you hunker down or you do what?
You stockpile? You prepare?
You evacuate.
Okay.
You evacuate. Yeah, I mean, look, you know, you've got huge long lines of traffic now on these hurricane-prone areas. When the hurricane is coming, there's people evacuating. They're leaving, right? In fact, you even have mandatory evacuations. You evacuate. Important point. Yet you could hunker down. Now, if an event like the impact, if the thing that had passed the Earth last June had struck the Earth, a lot of us would be hunkering down big time. There would have been no place to evacuate to, right? But if we knew with enough precision where the impact was going to occur, yeah, and we had enough time. But can you imagine you got a 2-week lead and now you've got to evacuate an area that's the size of Texas in 2 weeks? That's going to be a daunting task. Absolutely. So, but what do you do if you're faced with the prospects of a global catastrophe?
Well, yeah, like you said, there's nowhere to evacuate to.
Are you sure?
So,
Are you sure?
No, I'm now you're making me question that.
Question that.
Yes.
Do you think there's any potential place that humans, in the event of an impending global catastrophe, might evacuate to?
Well, God, if we could go to another planet.
Well, do you think, well, like what? Mars?
The
You
moon.
think there might, that'd be a daunting task. We're going to evacuate to Mars? Well, maybe 30, 50 years from now, maybe, but any place else possibly.
Okay, we got the moon.
Oh, the
There you
moon.
go.
God, I never thought of
Yeah.
that.
How did I not think of that?
I don't know, Mark. I was beginning
Yeah.
to
I mean,
wonder here.
next time there's a hurricane or a flood coming, I'm on the next spaceship.
Well, of course, now we're getting into the realm of totally into the realm of science fiction, right? I mean,
Maybe.
maybe. Let's see here. Uh,
You piqued my curiosity there with that those images in the hidden moon.
well, good. That was my intention. That was exactly. I achieved my goal. Yes, I did. Um, well, I'll tell you. Once you begin to put the pieces together, the whole story is laid out, and it's almost. I mean, it's so big and so profound that it's virtually unbelievable, and yet the more you learn, the more you realize that it's the outrageous story that's really the one that's most real. Um, Let me just go down here. I think I've got something here that would be of relevance to this. Let's see, is this it? Ah, here we go. Right. So this is from way back in 2007, but by then, scientists were already realizing that what I've been saying all along, we're cosmically vulnerable. So, what do you think is the first idea that they're proposing? Well, a lunar arc, proposed in case of deadly impact on Earth. The moon should be developed as a sanctuary for civilization in case of a cataclysmic cosmic impact, according to an international team of experts. NASA already has blueprints to create a permanent lunar outpost by the 2020s, but of course, politics has gotten in the way, and we should have had a permanent outpost on the moon decades ago, right? You know that our Apollo program got shut down because the Vietnam War ate up all of our money. So Nixon shut down the Apollo program to pay off the Vietnam War debt. So, NASA already has blueprints to create a permanent lunar outpost, but that plan should be expanded to include a way to preserve humanity's learning, culture, and technology if Earth is hit by a doomsday asteroid or comet, said Jim Burke of the International Space University in France, that still exists, by the way, and we should make contact with that particular group because they're doing cutting-edge stuff. One of the things I'm trying to do, Mark, is to forge links between all of the people and the research and the groups relevant to affecting this major transition within the next generation. Okay, Burke, once a project manager on some of the earliest American lunar landings, now heads an ISU study on surviving a collision with a near-Earth object. An impact of the size that wiped out the dinosaurs hasn't happened since long before the rise of humans, he pointed out. Yet scientists' expanding knowledge of asteroids and craters left throughout the solar system has created consensus that Earth remains vulnerable to a civilization-crushing collision. And what we know now from what we've learned in 2007, even more so. Okay? This calls for the creation of a space-age Noah's Ark, Burke said. Humans are just beginning to send trinkets of technology and culture into space. NASA's recently launched Phoenix Mars lander, for example, carries a mini disc inscribed with stories, art, and music about Mars. The Phoenix lander is a precursor mission in a decades-long project to transplant the essentials of humanity onto the moon and eventually Mars. The International Space University team is now on a more ambitious mission to start building a lunar biological and historical archive, initially through robotic landings on the moon, laying the foundation for rebuilding the terrestrial internet, plus an Earth-Moon extension of it should be a priority, Burke said. The founders of the group, Alliance to Rescue Civilization, notice the acronym, ARC, right, agreed that extending the internet from the Earth to the Moon could help avert a technological dark age following, for example, a nuclear winter, acts of terrorism, plague, or asteroid collisions. And I'd also mention that they left off that list would be gigantic volcanic eruptions. But the group also advocates creating a moon-based repository of Earth's life, complete with human staff facilities to, quote, preserve backups of scientific and cultural achievements and of the species important to our civilization. So there we go. It's
That
already
makes perfect sense. It's like backing up your computer. It's very risky to go without backing your stuff up on an external hard
that's
drive.
right.
So yeah, it
Now
makes
here-
sense to use the moon as our Earth's external hard drive.
Okay, so now let me just propose this as just an outrageous hypothesis to think about. What if the secret has been all along that we've already done that?
Mm.
Not now, not in our modern incarnation of civilization, but once upon a time, we've already done that. Outrageous idea. We don't even need, it's so ridiculous we don't even need to think about it, right? It's so contrary to our conceptions of ancient history that we shouldn't even waste time considering such outrageous possibilities, right?
Well, the
Or
truth is
not.
stranger than fiction.
That's what
And
they
the
say.
moon does some weird things, like how it always stays one face facing the Earth always, and there's always that dark side.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just the fact that it never rotates, it does rotate, but it rotates so perfectly that we always face the same size. That always seemed really strange to me, and that an eclipse is the exact same size as the sun, like perfectly. Um, I don't know. There's a lot of things about the moon that just seemed
Yes.
maybe artificial or unnatural.
We get into some really strange territory there. If we say it's artificial, what does that even mean? That somebody constructed it or something? Or, I mean, who or what would have some capacity to even undertake such a project?
These
So
are
this
all
really-
great questions.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
your question. Yeah. So I pointed out on this particular slide, I don't know if did you see the slide when I pulled it up? Are we still sharing screen?
No,
or
we're not sharing.
Okay, well, this was August 2007, and my title for this slide is An Ancient Idea is Revived and Promptly Forgotten. Because it's 2007. What are we doing here? 10, we're 18 years later. And I'm here trying to revive, say, look, this was actually proposed 17, 18 years ago. Of course, we've done nothing except, not as the government so much, but at least the private sector now is stepping into the void. And I'm like 100%, 110% behind the private sector space programs. And I want to see NASA revived, not because I have any particular affinity for government programs, but I believe that the imperative on us now is to make this transition to a cosmic civilization as quickly as possible. And I would like to set out a goal of saying one generation. One generation. By the time Angel is graduating from college, we're a spacefaring civilization. That's what I want to see.
Awesome.
Yeah. And but yeah, there's you brought up some interesting questions about the moon, and some of this stuff gets really technical. In this particular program that I've got here, I've come at it from two perspectives. One, the scientific perspective, and then the other, the traditional, which is the accounts, the legends and stories about the moon and moon gods and moon goddesses and so on. And so what I find, though, is that those two narratives, which one would think from conventional framework of thought would be completely separate, following their own paths, right? I suggest that they're doing this. They're converging, because what the ancient traditions are telling us, they're actually providing some answers to us of some of the very mysteries you just raised, some of the questions you just raised. See? And there was a reason why our ancestors were obsessed with observing the moon. We know that, right? I mean, obsessed with observing the moon. So, you familiar with Newark, Ohio?
No.
Okay, so let me show you this. This is a gigantic earthwork that, let's see, let's go here. And so this is a remnant of the great earthworks that once encompassed half the North American continent almost. Let's see, here we go. So now here's an artist's depiction of what this earthwork structure would have looked like when it was fully developed. And it's a gigantic series of earthworks, monumental in scale. You've got this flattened octagon here. You've got this big circle, almost perfect circle here. And you've got these outlying things all around, and you've got these apertures within the wall of this octagon. Then you've got a secondary wall. Now, if we go to the layout, here we go. So what is enshrined in this structure is all of the key rising and setting points of the moon through its very subtle 18.6-year cycle. If you look at these, minimum northern moonrise, maximum northern moonrise, minimum southern moonrise, maximum southern moonrise, minimum southern moonset, maximum southern moonset, minimum northern moonset, and maximum northern. So you've got all of these stations of the moon enshrined within this structure, so that if you know where to position yourself throughout this 18.6-year cycle, you can monitor the motion of the moon with a high degree of precision, which is now, as an example, would allow you to predict eclipses with relative ease, right? And you brought up the question of the coincidence, the rather interesting coincidence that the displacement of the lunar disk in the sky from the human perspective is virtually identical to the displacement of the solar orb in the sky from the human perspective. And it's that phenomena that is brought to our consciousness during every total solar eclipse. And with the solar eclipses that have happened in recent years, a lot of people have now had the chance to see for themselves photographs, videos, looking with the darkened glasses, and you can actually see that juxtaposition of these two circles up in the sky that are pretty much precisely the same size. Now, it varies some, right? Because the distance from the Earth to the sun varies a little bit. The distance of the moon to the Earth, it also varies. So sometimes the moon's a little bigger, sometimes it's a little farther away and a little smaller. And that's why we'll get, for example, an annular eclipse, and you still see a little bit of the ring around the sun, right? But overall, yes, we've got this rather interesting correlation. Well, we know this, that if we were to move the moon farther away significantly, what happens to the tides?
Would they weaken?
Oh, yes, very much.
So would
Yes.
we would lose them almost?
Yes, we would eventually lose them. Like right now, there are tides caused by Mars, but they're so minuscule, you can hardly measure them, and they have no real discernible effect. Whereas the lunar tides, what the lunar tides do is, in the zones of life on Earth, there are two great domains, the marine domain and the terrestrial domain. All models of the origin of life on Earth places the first life forms in the marine environment, and only later does it evolve to become a terrestrial species. The first forms of life and the oldest forms of life, the earliest forms of life, are marine, not terrestrial, okay? except for perhaps some siderophiles. But as far as any kind of life that could be, thought of as evolved to some extent beyond simple unicellular life. Now the question is how do you get, if you're cultivating various species, like if you're in the garden, you're cultivating roses and you want to create a hybrid species of rose. And so you go through this series of steps of modifying, making small modifications to its environment to try to get large outcomes, difference. There's a whole science behind roses. And in some cases, you can almost see that it has been presented as a metaphor for evolution in a way. But it's evolution that's controlled by humans, right? Even when we look at, we've created a whole bunch of different species of dogs through selective breeding, but they're still dogs, of course. We haven't created a separate species. And wolves can interbreed with dogs, so they're not fully separated with two different species. But so your problem is, okay, you've got your big ocean that you can cultivate, primitive life in. But if you want to get evolved life, you have to get it out of the ocean into the air and onto the continent. How do you do that? How do you make that transition? Well, you have to have an environment that partakes of some of the properties of both marine and terrestrial. So where's that environment? It's the intertidal zone. Take away the moon, you take away the intertidal zone. You have no way of getting primitive life out of the oceans and so life, the advancement of life is truncated in a marine environment. You're not going to get any marine species able to build spaceships and remove life from the earth before the next catastrophe. You got to get a species up on land to do that. So that's number one. And if you moved the moon too close, well, then what's going to happen? The tide is going to become, the intertidal zone is going to become too energetic, right? If the moon is half the distance now, the tides are going to be fierce. It's going to be much more complicated. You want to have this nice median zone in there, and it turns out, interestingly, the kind of the ideal proportion or ideal distance there happens to be right where it's at. About 1/400th the distance to the sun turns out to be about exactly what you want to achieve that effect. And you get some secondary value out of it. For example, that by studying lunar eclipses, you can now, for example, prove that light can actually bend around. If you have enough mass, and the moon is just enough mass that during a solar eclipse, we can actually see light bending around the moon. That's a very important insight in understanding the physical nature of reality, that light does that, right? Why? Because that's essential insight that if we're going to become a interstellar species, that's a fundamental fact upon which future technologies will be based. Now, the other question you mentioned, the other issue you mentioned was about always keeps the same face turned towards the moon. Well, let's, before we leave this, let's just say this raises a question. Why did they go to so much trouble that they moved a few million tons of Earth to create this gigantic complex to observe with high degree of precision the 18.6 year cycle of the moon? Why would they do that? What's the motive here? I mean, you're a subsistence farmer, you're a tribe of hunter-gatherers, nomadic. Why would you do this? It has no practical value, really, to your survival as a hunter-gatherer culture. But if this was an isolated example, you could perhaps say, well, these guys were just weirdos. For whatever reason, they had their king was half batshit crazy, and he said, hey, we got to build this big thing, and everybody did it, and they were all slaves, and nobody had a choice or whatever. We know that's not even close to the real story, right? But then the question is, why would they do this? Now, we can go to other places like Stonehenge, right? Look what's there. Midwinter, minor moonrise, major moonrise. Look over here, major, midsummer, moonrise, minor. The same alignments are built into Stonehenge. Why the hell? I mean, okay, for what purpose? For what purpose are they going to move these, 15, 20-ton stones? We know the altar stone here, the altar stone, 12-ton stone. We know now that it came from probably up on the Orkney Island on the northern end of Scotland. Right? Were you aware of this recent research that got published on the altar stone? Have you seen any of that yet, Mark?
I saw one quick 3-minute BBC report on it. That's all I saw.
Well, so yeah, here's the thing.
It's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. Now, if you look at this here, you've got two different kinds of stone. You've got the sarsen stone, which is the big cream-colored, buff-colored. It's largely a sedimentary, it's sandstone, but there's a lot of other stuff mixed in with it. But then a very contrasting type of rock is this bluestone rock, which is mostly rhyolite, which is a volcanic rock. And you'll notice you've got the outer ring of sarsen stones. You've got the inner, the five big, they're called the horseshoe trilithons. They're also the same type of sarsen stone. And it came from about 25 or 30 miles, from a quarry about 25 or 30 miles away. Now, these are big stones, dozens of tons they weigh. And, it could be done, I guess, but to haul it 20, 25 miles, that's an undertaking. And what do you got? You got 15 of these big stones that had to get hauled, and then all of these, presumably about 30 uprights and 30 lintels. So now you got these 60 stones here, and you got another, this is like 75 multi-ton stones you've got to transport from more than 20 miles away. Then you get to the blue stones, and they're coming from Wales. They're like over 100 miles away, 120 miles away, right? That's where the source of the blue stones come from. So now you got a big, huge labor effort in order to quarry those stones and transport them overland 120 miles to this site in southern England. It was believed that the altar stone was one of the blue stones from Wales. But some petrologists looked at it and said, no, it's not the same kind of rock. Really? Well, what kind of rock is it? Well, it's a different kind of rock that came from somewhere else. It probably didn't come from Wales because it's very distinct from the other blue stones. So a team set out to try to figure out where it came from, and they found that the only place that type of rock existed was in the very northern tip of Scotland. So that rock, 12 tons, had to be quarried and then transported at least 460 miles to get it to southern England. Now, go back 5,000 years ago in England, most of it's forested. It had to go across 3 mountain ranges, if it's by land, across multiple rivers, and then through several hundred miles of thick forest. You got to carry this 12-ton stone. Well, okay, maybe they didn't do it by land. Maybe they did it by sea. Well, now you got to say, okay, well, we didn't assume that these people were seafaring people. Obviously, they had craft capable of loading on a 12-ton stone, sailing down through the North Sea, which, of course, is, famous for, storms and inclement weather and all of that, which really wouldn't have been any much less easy than transporting it over land. So what's the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is that, like, even the archaeologists that were looking at this and realized where this came from said, well, they must have had one hell of a compelling reason for doing that. One of the things that made that altar stone easy to identify was its distinct lithology, its distinct composition. And it was very high in metal, especially barium. And that was one of the things that made it very easy to distinguish it between that and the blue stones. So it raises the question. Archaeologists go, well, they must have had a compelling reason. Then the petrologist says, oh, this is easy to identify because it's so distinctive and it's high in metal. I read that and I go, okay, now nobody is putting together, okay, here's this archaeologist. Well, they must have had a compelling reason. And then here we've got this distinct lithology. Well, could that have had something to do with the compelling reason? And I think the answer is, well, most likely, yes, it did. It was the unique composition of this particular rock that required moving it from the northern end of Scotland, 460 to 500 miles to the south of England. Then the question becomes, okay, wait a minute. We already know, it's pretty well established, that Stonehenge is an astronomical observatory of sorts for horizon astronomy. We know that in order to lay it out and to get all of these alignments precisely embedded, encoded into this monument, just like over at Newark, I don't know if you caught that or not. The terminology itself is sort of coincidental. But to do that, you had to have somebody who was very astronomically sophisticated. You had to have an astronomer. Maybe they didn't have big telescopes, but they sure knew how to identify the 18.6-year cycle of the moon. Now, ask yourself, how many you or all of your peers, you've seen the moon in the sky many times, right? How many of you would notice, well, over a decade or two and go, oh, you know what? There's an 18.6-year cycle. It's going to be in a slightly different place now, and it will not be at that point when it rises for more than 18 and a half years, but after 18.6 years, it's going to be back in that same spot again. Who would observe that? I mean, you could go through generation after generation without ever knowing that, right? But somebody knew that, and they considered it to be extremely important. And not only did they consider it important in England, ancient England, they considered it important in ancient America. To me, that raises questions that the mainstream archaeologists have no answer for. Now, if we're going to accept that they are incredible engineers, in order to quarry and transport and erect these stones or to move all of that earth, that takes an engineering capability. We can say, and the other thing is that in order to do something like this isn't something done by some itinerant band of eccentrics. No, a project of this scale and magnitude. And this is only one isolated example of dozens, if not hundreds, right? You had to have a highly organized social system, which is completely, to my mind, incompatible with the model of nomadic hunter-gatherers, right? But now we add this another element to it. If somebody has said we have to have for this altar stone, and notice now the altar stone, look, see, midsummer sunrise. What happens that morning of the midsummer sunrise? The sun's rays at summer solstice, the longest day of the year with the most intense solar energy feeding into the earth. Look, that sunrise comes right through here and shines upon this altar stone. They did not go to northern Scotland, quarry up a 12-ton stone, transport it all the way down and put it right in this key spot because they're superstitious. And how the hell did they know that this was a unique stone and it was high in metal? Unless they had sophisticated geological knowledge. Now, when we start putting all of that together, what I'm suggesting here is this. What we're looking at here is not some, the results of, some pre-scientific mindset, illiterate, superstitious. What we're looking at here, I think, is a component of an ancient technology. I would argue that that's what this is. And if we can free our minds enough to approach it from that perspective, I think we will finally begin to understand what these people were up to. And I think it is a remnant. I think what Stonehenge is likely an attempt later on to resurrect, to recreate the technologies that were lost during the Younger Dryas, if we want to get that precise in our terminology, that may have existed for millennia and millennia, but technology of a civilization whose imprint, I mean, we already acknowledge and think, futurists will say, if we can keep evolving our technology, we'll have, in the sophistication of our science and our civilization, and we learn how to completely integrate ourselves symbiotically with the terrestrial ecosystem, we will have a very small imprint, right? Now, we already know. Go back to the Industrial Revolution. Look at where we're at now, at least in the advanced nations. We'll use the U.S. Imagine 100 years ago, 150 years ago, during the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Think about the pollution, the poisoning of rivers. The Hudson River, for example, you couldn't fish or swim in it. It's been cleaned up. Well, that cleaning up, the cleaning up of the air, the cleaning up of the waters, the cleaning up of the environment, is the natural outcome of becoming an evolved, sophisticated civilization. And if you project from that, the idea is, well, if we progress, progress would imply that at some point we have evolved this where we are living integrally, symbiotically with the planetary environment. And at that point, see, the footprint of human civilization on the Earth is going to be very light. And 20,000 years into the future, it's going to be very difficult to discern it. You're not going to look for rusted car bodies. You're not going to be looking for, in fact, if you look at like some of the studies that have been done, what would archaeologists, if suddenly humans abandoned the planet and just left the planet totally to nature, and 10,000 years from now, archaeologists revisited the planet to see if it had signs of civilization, what would they look for? What would they find? Not much. A couple of things that got named. Well, the pyramids would still be around. Mount Rushmore might still be there to indicate that there had been somebody capable. But all the rest of it is gone. The city's gone. They've rusted away, eroded away. Yeah, there's nothing. Metal, steel erodes away. Even plastic is going to be pretty much gone in 10,000 years. What are you going to find to demonstrate that there had been an advanced civilization? If that civilization, the model of that civilization was ours, what we've got today, virtually nothing. What would you expect to find from a civilization that had learned to live with a very light ecological footprint on the planet? Well, nothing. You're not going to find much of anything, except the means of how do you power a civilization like that? Without reverting back to, barbarism, or without reverting back to hunter-gatherer existence, because obviously hunter-gatherers had a very low imprint on the environment, although we can find the evidence of their presence all over the place. Over 50 Clovis sites in North America alone, right? Occupied by quite a few people right up to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and then they disappeared. Well, where did they go? Have you ever thought about this, Mark? And we'll deviate for a second here. Think about this. Ever since colonists came here, even Indian stories, the Iroquois had stories about the big bones up on the, up in the Hudson Valley that they would encounter from time to time. Bones, skeletal remains of extinct megafauna along the Ohio River. When Lewis and Clark were about to set out on their expedition, and Jefferson was governor of Virginia, I believe, at the time, and he sent secret instructions via George Rogers Clark to Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark, and those instructions were to look for and see if they could find a specimen of a American incognitum, which, because nobody knew what it was, but we now know that it was mastodons. And mastodon skeletons had been found. Most of them have been picked over now, so you're not going to readily go walk along a tributary of the Ohio and find a skeleton of a mastodon sticking out of the mud. But they were finding that back in the 17 and 1800s quite frequently. The question in Jefferson's mind, does this thing still exist in the Western wilderness? And if you happen to encounter one, if it's at all possible, catch it and bring it back to Washington, right? So the point is that you've got these remnants all over, fossilized, and they're in peat bogs, they're in gravel pits primarily. Most of the fossilized remains of extinct megafauna are found in deposits that would have been created by megafloods, interestingly enough. But, we've identified numerous species. You think about just in North America, the dire wolves, the American Pleistocene lion, the cave bear, the giant short-faced bear, the woolly rhino, 4 species of mammoth, the mastodon, etc., etc., etc. We find their bones, we find the remnants of them all over the place. They're filled with in our museums and so forth. We know that in the last 300 to 400 years, of what is called the Balling Alarod that preceded the Younger Dryas, there was a culture here called the Clovis culture. They had over 50 sites of occupancy. We find the secondary effects of their presence. That's how we know 50 sites. We find their spear tips that they were cutting out of chert. We find the debitage, the waste material. We find their garbage dumps, their refuge. There must have been quite a few of them in non-glaciated North America. How many skeletons of Clovis people do we have in museums?
I haven't heard of any.
No.
Do we have none?
One possible teenage girl that was found up in Wyoming. But that's it.
So we have all these skeletons of megafauna and
all
no
over
humans.
The place. And where's the Clovis? Where are the Clovis skeletons? Think about that in the context of everything we've just been talking about. Now, getting back to this, if we go to the stories and the legends, we find over and over again themes. We find the themes of world destruction, right? Through floods and through fires, through cosmic floods and cosmic fires, I like to call them. We also find, almost as prevalent, legends of a former world order. Something now, whether you call it Atlantis or the Garden of Eden or Hyperborea or Shangri-La or on and on and on, what could be the reality behind that? Well, it's not like, what we can definitively state now is, all of these legends of world destruction by floods and fires, we can make a very strong case that they're based in reality. I mean, we mentioned the flood coming through the Spokane Valley. If we're looking at a flood that's 500 million cubic feet per second, anybody who could survive something like that by whatever fluke of fate would easily believe that the world had been destroyed. And the stories that they passed down, because you would have no way of knowing whether there were survivors on a mountaintop 50 miles away. And you would have no way of even getting out there and going there because in the immediate aftermath of a flood like that, you just saw, I showed you that slide, and you've got thousands, tens of thousands of acres of that landscape that was just layer after layer after layer of mud. Now, it's not going to be that easy to go out and, let's see if there's survivors somewhere else. Obviously, things have to dry out, and you have to be able to walk on it. You can't just go out and, walk. Now, you're going to set out. It's barren mud. It's a wasteland. What are you going to eat? There's no animals there. You can't hunt. There's no plants. So if you've survived, you're probably going to stay put for a generation or two anyway, while nature's ecosystem around you begins to recover. Then you can venture out. But in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, and we now know that the Younger Dryas involved not only gigantic floods, but gigantic fires as well. So, I mean, you might have like a double cataclysm, where first everything is burned off, then it's followed by submergence in a big flood. Now, you're an archaeologist coming along, 11, 12,000. I don't see any rusted car bodies. I don't see any pottery. There was nothing here. Nothing happened. That's pretty much Obviously oversimplified, but that's kind of the mindset. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a number of points. I would like to say this. We now know that the stories of floods and fires have a historical basis. What about the stories of the gods that every culture virtually has? Just like virtually every culture has stories about previous world destructions, virtually every culture has a story about the ancient gods. So what, if any, could the historical reality behind that be? That would be, to me, an interesting question. Now, you remember Arthur C. Clarke's famous dictum, any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. You ever heard that?
No, but that's a great quote.
Oh yeah, it's a pretty famous quote. Yeah, Arthur C. Clarke. Any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. You know, imagine you were 50 years ago and you had a working cell phone. Think about the cargo cults that had never seen an airplane, and then one day an airplane flew over their island. It's the gods, right? So what if the gods really aren't gods? They're members of a more advanced society with more advanced science. Is that a hypothesis worth conceiving and testing? I think the answer is yes, it is. Now, one of the things that made the gods and distinguished them from the rest of humanity was their ability to fly and the fact that they almost invariably came from the sky. I mean, again, over and over again, that's one of the constantly reiterative themes of the ancient traditions is the gods came from the sky. And like in the case of the Sumerian stories, with the onset of the Great Flood, it was so intense that the gods decided to hijack it out of here and left. They literally are to say it in the stories of Utnapishtim and others that the gods left. So what are we to make of stories like that? Well, I guess what I'm getting at here is on multiple fronts, I think we're standing on the threshold of a complete reevaluation of the human story on Earth. And once we have opened that door, the guy was knocking on the door, right? Once that door is open, and there is a time, we find that, nobody less than Jesus himself says at the end of the age, the secrets are going to be shouted from the rooftops. That which was hidden will be brought to light. I think we're in that time now. So I think also that once we bring to light those things that have been hidden for perhaps 200,000 years or longer, only then are we going to be able to see the prospects for our future. Stuart Brand, he was one of the original merry pranksters that brought LSD to my generation, right? He founded the Whole Earth Catalog. He was one of the early primer movers and shakers that helped to launch the internet age. Back, I remember one of the Whole Earth catalogs I used to get another. You ever heard of the Whole Earth Catalog?
No.
Okay. I'm glad to be able to.
This is good stuff.
It's rich, good stuff, yes. Well, it was like the printed predecessor of the internet, is what it was. If you look it up, you can find all about it. But there was a saying that was kind of their tagline, and it was this, and it was what Stuart Brand said: "We are as gods, so we might as well get good at it." And that was kind of the mindset behind that whole phenomenon in the early days, before it got corrupted by a bunch of different things, political and economic and vested interests and all that came in and really screwed up the original vision from, say, 1966 to 1969. And then it got subverted, and whole generations have come up afterwards that have not been privy to what that original vision was. But it's no coincidence that one of the early advocates of the human colonization of space was none other than Stuart Brand. You know, and you know when I said the merry pranksters, do you know who I'm speaking of?
No.
Okay, so there was a group on the West Coast that, you know, there was the whole phenomena that came around between 1966 primarily and like 1970, the last 4-5 years. Two things had a huge, huge influence on my generation: the Vietnam War and psychedelic drugs. Psychedelic drugs had a huge influence, completely pervaded all of culture. You know, I mean, if you look at, take as a sort of as a exemplification of that process in culture, look at the Beatles. And you follow their music, and what you see is this evolution from almost simple bubblegum music at the beginning, right? Please, please me, I want to hold your hand, et cetera, et cetera. Look what they're doing by 1967, right? Look at Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, that album, Sgt. Pepper's. It was epoch. It was like they took what had been just, you know, rock and roll at the sock hop and the, you know, they took it to a whole nother realm, and they took everybody else along with them that was listening to music, which was my whole generation. They went to the East. They sat at the foot of Eastern spiritual teachers and spiritual masters, which again opened the door, helped to open the door in 1967 to that whole philosophy of the Eastern philosophy, which was found by those of us who did experiment with psychedelics to be a way of confirming that, yes, those things that we experienced in these explorations of inner consciousness were also being achieved by yoga masters and Zen masters and tantric masters and people that had learned these technologies of transforming your own consciousness. Now, if you go back to, you've heard of Timothy Leary.
Mm-hmm.
Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor who, along with Ralph Metzner and he became Baba Ram Dass, right? The three of them were Harvard professors that all got booted out because they started experimenting with psychedelics, right? On the West Coast, you had Ken Kesey. You ever heard of him? Ken
Was
Kesey.
he the guy that wrote that movie and did the Yellow Bus movement? He wrote One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yes.
Is that him? Yes.
That's him.
Stanford
That's him.
Professor or something?
Well, he wasn't a professor. He was a student.
Okay.
And he needed money. You know, he hung out with a bunch of musicians and art students and literary students and all that. That was his background. It wasn't really so much scientific like with the East Coast bunch, like Leary, Metzner, and Alpert they were all scientifically trained. Okay, so he saw that they were offering, I guess, a stipend or something for looking for student volunteers to test some kind of drugs, and he volunteered. And it didn't know at the time that it was a CIA-sponsored program looking for mind control drugs. But one of the drugs that they tested and ultimately rejected because it, in fact, seemed to have the opposite effect of mind control was LSD. So he went in there, volunteered, and experienced LSD. And he was so blown away by what he experienced that he went and got a job as a night custodian at the building there where this stuff was kept, and was able to get access to it and started turning on all his friends, right? Well, that's what became the birth of the counterculture movement, what later by media were called hippies, but that was the birth of the counterculture movement. And so Kesey and his cohorts, one who was Stuart Brand and others, they discovered this whole other realm, you know, and you go into the whole psychedelic realm and the color and everything, you know, you get this whole different perspective on life and reality, and they were looking ways to express that artistically. So what they did was they allied with Stanley Owsley was his name. He was the sound man for a band called the Warlocks. I think he was already in the picture at that point. So he was also a chemist, and he learned how to manufacture LSD. And so he was manufacturing LSD, and they were putting on these festivals that were just open and free to anybody, and it's all these young people coming to it, and they mixed up Kool-Aid, and they would dose the Kool-Aid with LSD, and then people would drink a cup of that. And so they would have these festivals. They called them the Trips festivals. The festivals, everybody would be in this altered state of consciousness, and they would have music. That's where the light shows started. The Warlocks changed their name and became the Grateful Dead. You've heard of the Grateful Dead, I presume.
Oh,
so
yeah.
So the Grateful Dead were kind of like the leaders of this at that time, one of the first bands, along with Jefferson Airplane and Quicksilver and a bunch of others out of San Francisco primarily, that was around this hub, the Kenkesi hub, right? And they called themselves the Merry Pranksters, based on the stories, the medieval European stories of Till Eulenspiegel and his merry pranks, right? And I don't know if you've ever heard of Till Eulenspiegel and his merry pranks. Okay, so good. You're getting some important education here. So Till Eulenspiegel was the consummate archetypal fool that everybody thought was a fool, but he was also always the smartest guy, and his stories are about how he's always outwitting these pretentious people to think they know it all and all of that, and they'd have assumed he's a fool. Look him up and read some of those stories. They're very funny. Till Eulenspiegel would be U-L. If you put in T-Y-L and then U-L, Eulen, I think it's U-L-E, Till Eulenspiegel and his merry pranks. So that was the inspiration behind the Merry Pranksters. So what the Merry Pranksters did, and I think it was 1965, they created these vats of LSD acid. They got an old school bus and painted it up in psychedelic colors, and they began touring the whole United States, turning people on across the country. And that was kind of what launched the whole hippie movement and the whole counterculture movement.
It reminds me of the Eleusinian Mysteries.
Well, it's very much because it's almost a certainty that they were imbibing psychedelic substances during the Eleusinian rites, as with the Mithraic rites as well.
Yeah, have you gotten in touch with Brian Murarescu?
I have not.
I know he knows about you. We've talked about you before, but he wrote that book, Immortality Key. That's fantastic, and he kind of links the two. Albert Hoffman was very much in this. Was very curious about the Eleusinian mysteries, and people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, and then even the Romans carried this on. Marcus Aurelius, they all went through the Eleusinian mysteries, and it's a big secret of what they were doing there, but it's a lot of people think that they were drinking this koukion, this drink that was a beer that was probably spiked with some sort of psychedelic like ergot.
Yep.
And so Brian Murarescu, he does research in the Mediterranean. He does this archaeochemistry, and he's able to he was able to find ergot at one of the sites where they did the Eleusinian mysteries in Spain.
Yeah.
And so they haven't been able to sweep the Greek Eleusis yet and find the evidence of ergot, but I think that there is a connection between the use of psychedelics and the curiosity in space, because like this period of time that you're talking about in the 60s, it seems like people were very curious about space, and then there's the war on drugs, and for 50 years we kind of our consciousness changed, and we didn't really look to the stars as much, and you can even hear it in the music and the fashion. I like 80s music, I like 80s fashion, but it's not really looking towards the stars like that Beatles music you mentioned. And I've noticed a connection between the as above, so below. Like you do this inner work, and it makes you very curious about the stars and the heavens.
Yes.
I think you've mentioned this before with your cosmic civilization idea. It's like we need to do the inner work in order to want to expand outward.
Right. They yes, they're not mutually exclusive. The inner work and the outer work actually are mutually reinforcing. You have a whole positive feedback thing. And I think it's no coincidence that the whole rise of this psychedelic counterculture exactly coincided with our move into space. From Mercury through Gemini through Apollo. And then it's sort of when the space program was into Saturn rockets and everything were decommissioned, like in 73, 74, is when we shifted. And you see, there was you can see the mindset, the mental attitude shift because of its cultural expressions. You take music, for example, and you go look at the music from 67 to 70, and it's doing everything to just push it out. Listen to some of the early Pink Floyd. Set the controls for the heart of the sun, right? Listen to the early Dead, Aoxomoxa, Anthem of the Sun. Listen to early Quicksilver, Messenger Service, or any of the other, the doors of perception. Break on through to the other side. I mean, this was all that message. Then you get to like 70 and you see a shift. And what happens in the music? You see the bands, like, for example, the Grateful Dead being kind of exemplifying that whole sequence, that whole evolving mindset. Pushed, it was said by some reviewers that the Dead, when they did Anthem of the Sun or Aoxomoxa, or their first two live Dead, that they were exploring musical ground that most other musicians didn't even know existed. And they were. When you listen to Dark Star or Saint Stephen, or you listen to Aoxomoxa, or Anthem of the Sun particularly, which to me epitomizes itself in music, the attempt to recapitulate the psychedelic experience in music, right? The psychedelic journey in music. Well, now you get to 70, and what's happening? Well, the original hippies, who were like Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, the older ones who were a little bit older than me, who pioneered this whole thing, what did they do? They went out of the cities and they established communes. They established sort of, this is the whole back to the land movement, right? And so most of them didn't make it. A lot of them, some of them did. Some of them still exist. The farm in Summertown, Tennessee, still exists. The pig farm in Taos, New Mexico, still exists. There's still people there. I guess the originators are old geezers now, but it still exists. But what it was this reconnection with nature. For me, that was, the first time I did a psychedelic, I went to a disco, and lights and colors and music, having no idea what to expect, right? Other than the fact that I knew that it was something I wanted to try. I was so curious about it at that point from so many different directions that. So fall of 1968, I had just come and I had seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, which at that point was one of the most psychedelic movies ever made. And that really stretched my mind and made me think, you know what? I think after seeing that movie, I want to see what psychedelics is about. So I was able to procure I made some connections in the West Bank of Minneapolis, which is the sort of like the same, the counterpart of Haight-Ashbury. It was where all of the counterculture people, the Bohemians, all of them hung out there, and that became sort of the hub of the Midwestern counterculture movement, right? I got to know this guy, and he had direct connections to the Dead in Owsley. So I don't know if you ever heard the song Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix.
I have, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there was an acid called Purple Haze made by Owsley. That was first acid I did. And I went to this disco, and it was four of us, me and three buddies. And I had two hits. So I took one and shared one with one of my buddies. So two of us were tripping and two of us weren't. And it was the first time the two of us had ever done that. So I hadn't even been high on marijuana yet. So we're there, and I remember the two that weren't tripping were coming up to me and went, well, what's it like? What's happening? What, they wanted to know. And the only thing I could say was, I could almost not talk, but the only thing I could say, and I said it every time somebody asked me, I said, it's not what I expected. It's not what I expected. And I came away from there like convinced that there were higher orders of reality and that I had just visited an altered state that was, you think, okay, hey, I'm going to drop this and I'm going to hallucinate and, you're going to have all this stuff that's not real and all of that. That's kind of how I was anticipating it. Then I get there and I go, no, this is more real than my normal state of mind. What I was seeing through people. I was seeing people wearing masks. Like the masks fell away, and I saw that for the first time. So I'm senior in high school. This was fall of '68. The kid that went back to this was probably a Friday or Saturday night that I did this, going out. The kid that went back to school Monday morning was not the same person that left school Friday afternoon. And I had to get to the bottom. Okay, so I launched this quest. I couldn't wait to do it again. So a week or two later, I managed to get some more, and I went and I saw a rock concert. It was Deep Purple. I don't know if you remember that band, Deep Purple. My gosh, got to get you caught up on some of the history here.
Yeah, it seems like purple was a big fixation with a lot of these guys. Purple Haze, Prince, Purple Rain.
Yeah. And the disco that I went to, that first trip, it was called the Purple Cigar. So purple was,
Purple is a very rare color.
Yeah. But so I saw Deep Purple, and that completely blew me away. And so this is fall. So I'm doing psychedelic about once every week or two in different settings and stuff. Spring finally comes, and, I'd grown up in the outdoors, and, my effort was I wanted to break on through to the other side. I wanted to go, how far can I go with this? I mean, if I do 200 micrograms and this happens, what happens if I do 500 micrograms, But anyways, the winter passes, it gets to be spring. I get with some friends, and I always loved camping in the outdoors and hiking, so we decided to go on a camping trip and bring some psychedelics. And the first time I did a psychedelic drug in nature, that's the only way I wanted to do it from then on. So I'd shifted from going, to clubs and discos and concerts and light shows and everything to wanting to be out in nature. In a way, that was kind of what the whole evolution of the movement was. And you had this back to the land movement, where it's kind of like being pioneers again, young people going out and clearing land and planting crops and learning how to live off the land and having babies, not in hospitals, but with midwives and all of that kind of stuff. And it's reflected in the music. If you go and you listen to the music, you'll see, some of the first pioneers of psychedelic rock, the Byrds and the Dead and all these many, many other bands. Now they're doing almost folk, country, western, bluegrass type influences coming in. If you listen to the transition from Live Dead, epitome of psychedelic music, to the next album they came out with, Working Man's Dead, followed by American Beauty, it's like, okay, they've gone out as far as you can go with this. Now they've come back to Earth. Now, what's going on in space? While all of this is happening, we're moving into space. So think about the first moon landing, summer of 1969. No coincidence, that's the summer of Woodstock. So the whole counterculture movement sort of peaked at the same time, really, the space program and the fervor and interest of the space program amongst the American population sort of reached its peak in 1969. Then it began to slowly decline, and then you see pretty much the whole counterculture movement disappears along with the Vietnam War, and at the same time, we basically scrap our rocket fleet and forget about space.
Hmm.
It's no
It seems like
coincidence.
there's a bit of a renaissance or a return to psychedelics happening right now, especially with the rise of podcasts and people like Joe Rogan being such big
Mhm.
advocates for it. And then you have people like Elon Musk, who I've heard is a big psychedelic user. And, everybody's got their opinion about Elon Musk, but he is presenting a vision to us of, oh wow, we can go back out there. He's giving people a reason to get out of bed in the morning and having a hope for the future. It
Yeah,
can't just be all practicality. The
no,
mindset in the
exactly.
70s and 80s was like, why are we spending our money on this? What are we going to get back from our investment? But now it's very much like we have to do this for the sake of our own consciousness to get to another planet.
Yes. And there is this, it's called the overview effect. And the overview effect, I used to be a diver and I remember what they called rapture of the deep, having just mild, experiences of that. And there's space rapture as well. And a lot of, not all, because a lot depends on your orientation going into the thing, but a lot of the astronauts and cosmonauts came back from space with their mind blown and a new spiritual outlook on life. Um, and that's happening. So you had this sort of exploring the outer frontier at the same time we're exploring the inner frontier. I think that those things were not disconnected. I think there was a greater reality that united both the ventures into the cosmic realm and exploring the cosmic realm out there and exploring the cosmic realm in here. And yes, we need that renaissance. It's time to come back again um, because again, what we know now, we didn't know then. We didn't know in the 70s that this planet we live on is vulnerable to the cosmic catastrophes. We didn't know that. Now we know that. And we
Hmm.
don't know how much time we have until the next one, other than the fact that if we go through 250,000 years of Earth history, which encompasses the known time that we humans have been here, there have been multiple episodes of interglacial warmth, but none of them have lasted this long.
Hmm.
What are we to make of that?
Hmm. Yeah, from going to the many events of yours that I've gone to, I've noticed there is this interesting connection between, like, you don't really talk about psychedelics much. That's not like your thing. We talk about geology and catastrophes and ancient civilizations, but then it seems like everybody that goes to your events is very much interested in psychedelics as well. It's like this connection that, I don't know, once you open your mind in one area, you kind of want to explore the other areas too.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
um,
for me, it was an awakening that made me curious about everything.
One thing I
And
did want to ask you about,
yeah, please do.
um, so I love how you uh, tell us about the deeper meanings of things that we just take for granted in our everyday life, like the number of numbers on a clock or the number of feet in a mile. These are things that we just assume are okay, that's the number, and we move on. And I love how
Yeah.
you dig deeper and tell us like the deeper meaning behind these things. And
Well,
so
yeah.
every time I stumble upon some random thing that I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. If I'm looking at the word night and it's got a K in front of it, I'm like, why is there a silent K in there? Why not just get rid of it? Or the
Uh,
word knife. I instantly think of you and I wonder, maybe that's hiding, maybe that's a clue to some deeper mystery. And so, yeah, I wanted to ask you about spelling and words and silent letters. And like,
mm,
for instance, the Pacific Ocean. It's got, oh no, Pacific Ocean. Yeah, it's got three C's in it, and all the C's make a different sound.
hmm
Pacific Ocean. All the
mm,
C's make a
yeah,
different sound.
yeah.
And I'm just curious, do these silent letters, are there any like hidden things in our language
Well,
that's a
I
big
think,
question, I guess.
yeah, that's a big question. And that I think would get us into the realm of the Kabbalah and the various iterations of Kabbalah. whether Hebrew or Greek or Arabic, it does look at exactly that. Some of the hidden structures of our words and our language, and that there's more to the structure of our language than meets the eye. Just like you're kind of implying that, you just take it for granted that, you mentioned the mile, right? Do you know how many feet are in a mile?
5,280.
All right, you get an attaboy, Mark. That's
Okay,
right.
I've listened to enough of your lectures to know that now.
Okay, 5,280 feet. Now, a mile, the term mile comes from the same root as the word mil, which means 1,000 in Latin, right? Because it was generally a standardization of 1,000 paces. But where was the origin of that, right? Where did the mile originate? Who was the first to use the 5,280-foot mile? Well, it's kind of lost to history. But interestingly, if we go back to Stonehenge and we look at that sarsen stone ring, there's two ways you can measure it. If you measure the center line of the upright stones, or you can measure the outer face of the stones. Okay, so if you measure the outer face of the stones across, it works out to be just a little bit and possibly more, right around 105 and a half feet. 105 and a half feet, right? We can refine that because there are 30 of the, remember there was the big uprights and then they had the lintels on top. 30 of those, so you had 30 lintels, and they've been accurately measured. These are very precisely tooled stones. They've been measured, and the conclusion is that they were intended to be just over 10 and a half feet, maybe around 10.56 feet, right? So now the center line of the uprights is 10.56. The length of the sarsen stones, of the lintels on top, the horizontals, 10.56, right? Now, if the outer face of the monument's 105.6, what is that suggesting? Well, if 105.6 and you divide that by 10.56, then you've got 10. So in other words, the outer diameter is 10 times the unit that was that defined the spacing of the sarsen stone uprights, which would suggest that there's a consistent unit of measurement being employed there, right? Well, here's what's interesting about 105.6. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but if I...
Yep.
Yep, 105.6. Now I'm going to go times 50. And what is that?
There's the mile.
There's the mile.
5,280.
Yeah. Now, is it a coincidence then that the outer diameter of Stonehenge is almost precisely 1/50th of a mile?
I don't know.
Well, it'd be a coincidence if that's what it was. But, the origin of the mile is in ancient Britain somewhere. So should we be too shocked? This is part of the imperial system of measurement that we use in America. We inherited that from Britain. Feet, yards, furlongs, miles, those are all part of the imperial system, which we inherited from Britain. But is this suggestive that there was a consistent unit of measurement from which our mile has been derived? It goes back to Stonehenge 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. Well, maybe. Maybe. But,
yeah, and there's
you'd have to find more evidence and more correlations to really make some kind of an affirmative statement about that. But maybe.
Yeah, it seems like there's a big push to get rid of the imperial system and just go to the metric system. But I think we'd lose something important if we do that.
We most definitely would lose something if we did that. So in the Kabbalah, there's, you're looking at inner meanings, hidden meanings in words and language. And we could do a podcast just talking about that sometime, because for me, the best way is to show people examples.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just showed you an example, but there could be many examples shown that would sort of convey, I think, the essence of that idea.
Yeah, another one of those examples that stuck out in my mind that I wanted to ask you about is the way we label numbers.
Yeah.
Um, the numbers 11 and 12 never made sense to me. I always thought it should be 1 teen, 2 teen, 13, 14. And I always thought, well, maybe 11 and 12 are hiding something there.
Huh. Okay.
I don't
Now,
know if you ever thought about that, but
no, I really can't say that I have actually. So,
well, I don't know. This is way out there, but I we're kind of on a 10 base system. Like every 10
yeah,
it changes to the next rotation of numbers.
yeah.
But perhaps at one point we were on a base of 12. And it goes up to 12, and then you start 13 would be 1 teen, 2 teen, and then
Mm-hmm.
you get to 11 teen, 12 teen, and then you switch to the 20s. I don't know. I thought that maybe 11 and 12 might have been kind of a clue to something deeper. I don't know if you ever heard about that.
Well, I can't say that I have, but now that you raise the issue, it's not impossible, I would think. Yeah.
All right.
Good question.
Yeah.
You
Who
got me
knows?
on that one.
All right. How about levitation?
Levitation. Well, we could certainly talk about that in more depth. I'd kind of hesitate to go there without a little bit of preparation, other than the fact that we've already talked about and tried to establish the possibility of technology, lost technologies. Now, as a builder, there have been times when we've had to move heavy, usually it's steel I-beams that might weigh half a ton to a ton. So I know that, there's some skill involved with knowing how to do that. And typically, if I've got, the project scale of projects that we do or did back when I was, fully active doing that, we usually wouldn't have more than a few beams in a project. You might have a span, you've got a long span of 20 feet, and you want no intermediate supports. You want let's say we did a garage one time, an auto mechanics place where you wanted to have a span of 3 garage doors wide with no intermediate supports. So you got to bring in a beam, a big old beam. It might be 14, 16 inches in depth, 20 some feet long, and that might weigh a ton. And you got to get it up there. Now, for one, we didn't bring in a crane for that because we had a system that we would use jacks, and we would simply pry up one end and put a shim under it, and then we would lift up the other end and put a shim under it until we got up to where we could get jacks under it, and then we'd basically jack it up. There's more to it than that, but obviously, if we were going to do 100 beams, that would not be an economical way to do it, right? You bring in a crane. So when we're moving weights of that scale, we're using heavy equipment, right? Now, assuming they didn't have equipment back then, but they were moving 12-ton stones, 20-ton stones, 30-ton, 50-ton stones sometimes. And you could go, okay, well, this is just a culture of eccentrics that, they wanted to move this 12-ton stone 460 miles for some superstitious reason. But when you consider that, okay, in prehistory, there wasn't supposed to be anybody who had sophisticated civilization or engineering know-how, but somehow all over the world, we find these ancient cultures which are for the most part lost to history, and they're moving these gigantic stones around. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is, okay, if I was living off the land and hunting, And why would I spend my spare time quarrying a 20-ton stone and moving it miles away and erecting some structure out of it? Why would I even do that? Again, it comes back to this question, why lay out a monumental structure to the very subtle, almost not even discernible movements of the moon? Well, why do that, right? Why quarry 20-ton stones and move them? Well, when you think of the brute force involved, yeah, I mean, it becomes very incomprehensible. But if, on the other hand, you go, any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, maybe they had a technology that allowed them to levitate. I think that's a totally realistic question. In fact, I would argue that that's probably more feasible than the idea that independently all of these primitive tribes around the world decided to quarry 20-ton stones and transport them dozens and sometimes hundreds of miles, which to me is absurd. It's ridiculous. How do you square that? These are nomadic hunter-gatherers, maybe subsistence farmers. Now, are you telling me, where did this leisure time come from? And the sedentary lifestyle that is implied by building a structure like Stonehenge or Newark earthworks. Why is that acceptable, but to say they might have had the ability to levitate something is completely, you can't even talk about that without being labeled a crackpot. That's my take on it. And so some of the things that I've been learning about in the last 5 years, some of the new technologies that are coming on down the pipeline, I think have potential in that direction and have implications as far as the ability to move heavy objects with natural forces. I think that's something that we're going to have to be acknowledging within a decade. Why? Because I think we're on the verge of rediscovering how the fuck they did it.
Yeah, I remember you talking about, was it the Ark of the Covenant or some sort of ark that only the Levites could
Yes.
carry and move? And then,
Yes.
the basis of the word Levite is levitate.
Yeah.
And
well, levitate. Yeah, the word Levite. Yes, that's right. Okay.
So the clue is in the word. It's the secret is hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, there it is right there, isn't it? Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of things to talk about. I'm getting a little hoarse, and I'm going to take a quick run before this nearby grocery store closes in 50 minutes.
All right, Randall, this has been another amazing episode. Thank you so much for taking the time. It is always a pleasure to reconnect, and I will see you soon on the next trip.
Yeah,
there's Arizona.
There's a lot more to talk about. I'll show you one thing in departing, which you'll find interesting. Let me go back to share, screen, window.
You always leave me on a cliffhanger.
Share. Let's see if I can now. All right. Are you seeing full screen?
Mm-hmm.
Now, here are some earthworks in North America.
I'm not seeing full screen. I'm seeing a presentation mode.
Oh, stop sharing. Let me redo it. Sorry. Share, screen, window, and share. Now you should see it, hopefully.
Yep. That looks good.
Okay, so here's another geometric earthwork, a perfect, almost perfect square with apertures, sighting apertures in it, a circle. I want you to notice the diameter of the outer circle. Notice how many feet it is?
1056.
1056. Yeah. So in other words, that circle is exactly 10 times the diameter of the Sarsonstone circle at Stonehenge.
Mm-hmm. And this is in Ohio.
This is in Ohio.
Hmm.
And that structure was maybe even being built at about the same time Stonehenge was. Again, diameter of circle, 1050 plus feet, probably originally 1056. There's quite a few examples of that. And again, here, 19th century investigators, such are the predominant features of this remarkable series of works. As already remarked, the coincidences observable between them could not have been the result of accident, and it is very manifest that they were erected for common purposes. What those purposes were, the reader must judge. So, without getting into it in any detail at all, the takeaway here is that it looks like somebody was building monumental structures in the British Isles, and somebody at the same time and maybe later was building monumental structures in North America, and they were using the same system of measurement. And out of that system of measurement is probably where our system of imperial measurements originally rose. And we are still using a system 5,280 feet mile, which is, for example, 5 times. So that circle that we just looked at there is 1/5 of a mile. 5 of those in tangent to each other, and you have exactly a mile. Coincidence, or are they using the same system of measurement? And if they're using the same system of measurement, the same system of astronomical alignment, engineering skills, tremendous social organization skills on a on a level completely outside of anything within the framework of normal history, accepted history, I think we're forced to say, okay, time to reconsider. And there's a hidden past, and that's that door. Behind that door that guy was knocking on, you open that door, and there's this tremendous magisterial realm, which is the real story of the human species on planet Earth.
I love it. And we'll find out what's inside the moon, too.
We'll work on that. I will say this, though. We've got, just for your listeners, excuse me, I'm getting a little hoarse, but at the end of this month, February 28th, I'm going to be doing a sacred geometry retreat at Beersheba Springs Assembly on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee. Beautiful place. And 28th, is going to be the grand alignment. I don't know if you knew that or not. 28th of February, we're going to be able to see the visible planets and the moon all arrayed in the sky at one time. So the kickoff to this retreat, immersive sacred geometry retreat, is going to be to see that spectacular array in the sky, hopefully connect a lot of people with that level of the cosmic domain, because once you get hooked into it, it becomes almost addictive, that's Jupiter, that's Mars, here comes the moon, and you're tracking those movements. And while you're doing that, it's triggering something in here. So we're going to be doing hands-on. It's going to be the methods, this is what we'll be using, these handmade compasses and all supplies, all food. The place is was a sacred site to the Native Americans. The Beersheba Springs was a sacred spring. But anyways, it's a very unique place. We're going to start Friday night, and we're going to conclude Monday morning, and it's going to be a retreat, and it's the first sacred geometry retreat I've done in 2.5, 3 years. So.
Well, your retreats are the best. Some of my best memories are those retreats. Well,
good. And we're going to be doing one geological outing and one architectural outing. We're going to go see the chapel, All Saints Chapel in Sewanee, Tennessee, which is the architect was inspired by Amiens and Chartres cathedrals. So we're going to be learning about some of the symbolism in geometry by actually doing these drawings, and then we're going to take a trip to this chapel, and we're going to see some of the geometry manifest in stone and stained glass and mosaic floors, that sort of thing. So if anybody's interested, wow. I mean, we've got I think 2/3 of the tickets are sold. They're going about 2 or 3 a day now. So I'm expecting to possibly be sold out in a week or two. Where I'm looking at maybe trying to add a few more seats in there. But anyways, yeah, go to how to, let me see, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Here's where people are interested and go, howtube.com/RC, that's for Randall Carlson, SG for sacred geometry. RCSG. Howtube.com/RCSG, and you'll find out, I think, everything you're going to need to know about it and more.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
I can say that on your retreat, your 1 week retreat, I learned more in that 1 week than I did in all 4 years of college. So,
oh, really? Well, darn, I need to charge more then.
yeah, right.
Yeah. Let's see. So 4 years of college would be how much? About $200,000?
Oh my God. Well, now it would. I don't know. Back then it was probably 60. No, maybe 120.
Maybe 100. Okay, I'd settle for 60,000 for a weekend.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
weekend of work. Well, we need to talk about. We need to have another conversation. We talk about, okay, if these ancient principles are being recovered and re-engineered, and we're actually learning about them, how do we practically apply that to creating prototypes of a potential civilization? And that's what I want to talk about, because how do we bring in the geomantic engineering, the sacred geometry, the cosmic alignments, the all of that stuff that seems to be components of these ancient building projects that we see all over the world, and the technology behind that, and possibly the control and influence of these subtle forms of energy. So there's a lot more to talk about. And then from there, my real goal over the next decade is to let's take that and establish some experimental prototypes that can become centers of education and enlightenment.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
100%.
100%.
Well, we got a lot more to talk about. I'm going to end this.